The woman standing at the far end of the platform held two infants, one against each shoulder, and did not cry. That was what nobody expected. 7 men had walked up to her that morning, looked at the babies, and walked away without a single word of apology. The 8th man, a rancher named Clifford Hayes, had been the boldest. He stepped close, looked Naomi Ashcroft directly in the face, and said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, "I ordered a wife, not a charity case." Then he laughed, and several men laughed with him. Naomi did not flinch. She just shifted the weight of both babies and looked past him like he was smoke. That moment, 1 woman, 2 infants, 8 rejections, and a crowd that watched without intervening is where this story begins. And if you've ever been dismissed by people who never took the time to know you, then what happens next will stay with you for a long time. If this is your first time finding this channel, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Because what these 3 people build together is something no one on that platform saw coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform. The morning the mail-order brides arrived in Calverton, the whole town showed up. That was not unusual. Bride days, as the locals had taken to calling them, drew more spectators than the 4th of July parade and nearly as many as a hanging. Men stood along the wooden rail of the depot platform with their hats in their hands, some nervous, some eager, a few already drunk before 10 in the morning. Women from town gathered near the mercantile across the road, pretending to examine bolts of fabric while watching everything through the window glass. Children climbed fence posts for a better view. The train from Abilene had brought 9 women this time. 9 women who had answered advertisements in Eastern newspapers, packed everything they owned into a single trunk, and traveled days across a continent to meet men they had never seen, in a town they could not have found on a map. Naomi Ashcroft was the last one off the train. She came down the steps slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she was carrying Della against her left shoulder and Rose against her right, and the steps were narrow, and the babies were 8 months old and heavier than they looked, and no one from the platform moved to help her. She got down on her own. She straightened her back. She looked out at the row of men waiting and did not smile or wave or do any of the things the other 8 women were already doing. The other 8 women were younger. Most were in their early 20s. 2 were quite pretty in a way that the frontier had not yet worn down. They stood in a cluster near the depot agent's window, and the men were already moving toward them, introducing themselves with names and land sizes and the number of cattle they ran. Naomi stood slightly apart. She had set the travel bag down between her feet and was adjusting Rose's bonnet, which had gone sideways during the last hour of the journey. Della had fallen asleep again. She always fell asleep when the motion stopped. A man approached. He was somewhere in his 40s, thick through the chest, wearing a vest with a watch chain. He stopped about 4 feet away from Naomi and looked at the babies the way a person looks at an unexpected bill. "Those yours?" he said. "Yes," Naomi said. He took a long breath through his nose and let it out slowly. Then he turned and walked back toward the other women without another word. Naomi had known that would happen. She had known it since Abilene, when 2 other women on the train, also there for the bride selection, had moved to a different compartment after she told them about the twins. She had known it since she filled out the advertisement form in Philadelphia 3 months ago, in the small room she rented above the laundry on Carpenter Street, with Rose and Della asleep in the one crib she owned and enough money left to last her approximately 6 weeks. She had written honestly in that form. She always did things honestly, which was part of the reason her life had become so difficult. Widow, age 31. 2 infant daughters, 8 months, capable, hardworking, experienced in household management and basic accounting. Seeking a man of steady character who understands that family is not always what you're born into. She had not expected many responses. She had gotten 3. 2 withdrew when they found out the babies were not yet a year old. The third, a man named Gerald Prouse, who ran a small cattle operation outside Calverton, had written back twice and seemed genuinely interested, and that was the reason she had climbed onto that train. Gerald Prouse was not at the depot. She had asked the depot agent about him. The man had scratched the back of his neck and said, "Prouse sold his operation about 6 weeks ago, moved up north somewhere, didn't leave word." So there was that. She was now standing on a platform in a town she did not know, in a territory that was not hers, holding two babies who were getting hungry, with $22 and some coins in the bottom of her travel bag, and 9 men who were one by one pairing off with the other women and not looking in her direction. The second man who approached her was Clifford Hayes. She had heard his name mentioned by a few of the women on the train. Apparently he was known in this part of the territory, ran a decent-sized operation east of town, mid-40s, twice widowed. He walked up to her with more confidence than the first man, and for a brief moment Naomi thought he might actually be different. He was not different. He looked at the babies. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the babies again. "I ordered a wife," he said, "not a charity case." He said it loud. He said it the way men said things when they wanted other men to hear, and several of them did hear, and several of them laughed in that short, sharp way men laugh when they're covering their own discomfort with someone else's cruelty. Naomi looked past him. She focused on a fence post across the road. She counted the boards in the fence, 3 horizontal rails, weathered gray. She had learned to do this years ago, this trick of finding something solid and counting it while the worst of a moment passed through her. It worked. Her hands did not shake. Her face did not change. Hayes walked away, still chuckling. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th men did not bother approaching. They had watched the first 2 and drawn their conclusions. The 6th man, young, maybe 25, visibly nervous, came close, looked at the babies, said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't," and had the decency to look ashamed of himself as he retreated. The 7th man was older, 60-something, quiet, a farmer by the look of his hands. He stood near Naomi for almost 2 minutes without speaking. She waited, holding both girls, feeling Rose beginning to stir against her shoulder. The old man finally said, "You're a brave woman." Then he walked away too. By that point, all 8 of the other women had been paired with men and were already moving off the platform. Some toward wagons, one toward the hotel, all of them becoming someone's prospect for the week ahead. The platform cleared with surprising speed. Naomi was the only woman left. The depot agent reappeared in his doorway and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pity and inconvenience. "You need the eastbound back to Abilene?" he said. "That'd be tomorrow morning, 7:15. "Not yet," she said. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" She did not answer that immediately, because the honest answer was no. And she was calculating whether she could afford the hotel on what remained of her $22, and whether a hotel in this town would rent a room to a single woman with 2 infants, and how long she could make the money last if she was careful, and what the train fare back to Philadelphia would cost, and what was waiting for her in Philadelphia, which was nothing. The room above the laundry had already been let to someone else by now. The landlord had made that clear. "I'll figure it out," she said. She sat down on the bench at the far end of the platform. Della was still asleep. Rose was fully awake now, making the small, insistent noises that preceded actual crying. Naomi reached into the bag and found the bottle she'd prepared that morning and fed her, right there on the platform bench, while the depot agent went back inside and the last of the crowd drifted away, and the sun climbed another inch or 2 toward noon. She was not going to cry. She had decided that sometime around the 5th rejection, though she couldn't recall precisely when. Not crying did not mean she wasn't frightened. She was frightened in that particular way that comes not from one large disaster, but from many smaller ones accumulating over time until the weight becomes its own kind of emergency. Thomas had been dead 14 months. He died of a fever in the 2nd week of March, 3 weeks before Rose and Della were born. Naomi had been present for his burial, enormously pregnant, in a churchyard outside Philadelphia in cold mud, and then she had walked back to their rented rooms and 3 weeks later delivered 2 girls into the world with only the neighbor woman and a midwife attending. She had not had time to fully grieve Thomas because she had 2 infants immediately requiring everything she had. In some ways she was grateful for that. In other ways, the grief had simply been displaced into the background of her daily life, never properly processed, always there. She had tried to stay in Philadelphia. She had the laundry room. She had the neighbor woman who sometimes watched the babies. She had found piecework, sewing, some accounting for a small shop on Market Street. It had not been enough. Philadelphia was expensive, and the piecework was inconsistent, and the neighbor woman moved away in October. By November, Naomi had understood that something had to change. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed almost absurd the first time she read it. Western men of property seek capable women for marriage. Frontier life. Must be willing to work. She had read it twice, then folded the newspaper and put it away. She had gotten it back out 2 days later and read it again. It had not seemed absurd the second time. It had seemed like information. She was, at her core, a practical woman. Thomas had loved her for that, among other things. She could see situations clearly without romanticizing them. The situation in Philadelphia was clear. She was running out of options. The situation described in the advertisement was also clear. These men needed wives. She needed stability. The exchange was honest if nothing else was. She had not expected love. She had hoped, quietly and without drama, for simple decency. A man who would treat her fairly and not resent the girls. That had apparently been too much to ask. Rose finished the bottle and settled. Naomi held her against one shoulder and Della against the other and sat in the thin October sunlight on the platform bench and let herself think about what came next. The math was not good. $22 would get her back east if she was careful, but back east to what? She had no room, no employment arranged, no family left. Her mother had died 2 years before Thomas. Her father she had not seen since she was 12. She was still running the numbers when she heard horses. Not one horse, several, moving fast on the main road and then slowing as they approached the depot. She looked up. A group of riders, 4 of them, coming in from the eastern road. They were moving with the purposeful speed of men who were late for something and knew it. The man in front was unlike the others. He was tall in the saddle. She registered that first. Not young, not old. Somewhere in his 40s, perhaps, though the frontier had a way of adding or subtracting years from a face depending on how hard it had used the person. He was not dressed like a man trying to impress anyone, but the horse he rode was an extremely good horse, and the men riding behind him rode like hired hands, which meant the man in front employed them, which meant something about his position. He came to a stop at the hitching post. The 3 men behind him stayed mounted. He dismounted, handed his reins to one of them without looking, and walked toward the platform. He walked like a man who owned the ground under his feet, not arrogant. There was a difference between arrogance and certainty, and what Naomi read in his movement was certainty. He looked at the platform. He looked at the depot doorway. He looked at the women. He looked at the women. Both of them. The only women remaining on the platform. His eyes moved across the empty platform, taking in what was no longer there, and then they settled on Naomi and the babies, and he stopped walking. He stood there for a moment. Just stood there. He was looking at her the way people rarely looked at her. Not with pity, not with calculation, not with the particular blankness people wore when they had already decided they were going to refuse you. I was looking at her like she was a problem he found genuinely interesting. The selection was this morning, Naomi said. She said it before he could say anything, which she recognized as a defensive habit and couldn't stop herself. You've missed it. I can see that, he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but quiet, in the way a man is quiet when he doesn't need volume to be heard. Are you waiting for the eastbound? He said. Not yet. He looked at the babies again. Rose had fallen asleep. Della was awake, watching him with the absolute uncomplicated attention that infants had before they learned to be polite. How old? He said. Naomi almost said it's none of your concern. She stopped herself. The man had not done anything to deserve that. 8 months, she said. He nodded, very slightly, as if this confirmed something. Then he looked at the depot door and called out, Whitmore. The depot agent reappeared. Mr. Blackburn, sir. Didn't expect you this. Were there other women on this morning's train? The man said. Besides the bride candidates? No, sir, just the 9. And this lady's the last one left. Wesley Blackburn, because that was apparently who this was, looked at the depot agent for another second, then turned back to Naomi. Wesley Blackburn, he said. He did not offer his hand because her hands were full of sleeping babies, and she noticed that he noticed that. I own the Blackburn Ranch, east of town. Naomi Ashcroft, she said. Mrs. Ashcroft. It's Mrs., yes. He waited. He did not fill the silence with noise, which was unusual. Most men, when they found out a woman was widowed and alone, immediately tried to say something helpful or reassuring or both, and almost always made it worse. This man just waited. My husband died 14 months ago, she said. Because he was still waiting, and the silence was beginning to feel like an actual question. Before the girls were born, I came out here in response to an advertisement, a man named Prouse, but he'd already moved on. Blackburn's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted. Prouse was a fool, he said, in general, selling that operation when he did cost him considerably. I wouldn't know about that. No, I suppose you wouldn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you eaten today?" Naomi blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not one of them. "I'm fine," she said, which was not an answer. That wasn't the question. She looked at him directly then, trying to read him, and found the same thing she had found when he first rode in. Certainty, but no cruelty in it. "I had something on the train," she said. "This morning." It was well past noon. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned toward his men, still waiting mounted at the hitching post, and said, "Ride back and tell Mrs. Garrett I'll be late. Tell her to hold dinner." He turned back to Naomi. "There's a decent eating house on the main street. They won't bother you about the babies." Naomi stood very still. "Mr. Blackburn, I don't need— You've been sitting on that bench for," he looked at the sun, "probably close to 2 hours, holding 2 infants, having been refused by every man in this town, and you haven't eaten since this morning." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a meal and a conversation, which is what the week was supposed to be anyway, if I'd gotten here on time. You can say no." She did not say no. She was hungrier than she had admitted to herself, and her feet hurt, and the bench was hard, and Della was beginning to fuss, and she was tired. Not the regular tired of a difficult day, but the deeper tired that had been building for 14 months. She stood up. She adjusted Della's weight and picked up the travel bag and said, "All right." They walked off the platform together, Naomi Ashcroft carrying both her daughters, Wesley Blackburn walking beside her with his hands loose at his sides, and the few remaining people on the main road stopped what they were doing to watch, because Wesley Blackburn was, as the town would confirm to anyone who asked, the most eligible and most stubborn bachelor in 3 territories, and he had never once shown interest in any of the women who came through on bride days. The eating house was run by a woman named Agnes Hartley, who was somewhere past 60 and had opinions about everything and kept them mostly to herself, which made her restaurant a place where people could eat in relative peace. She gave them a table near the back window, looked at the babies with the assessing expression of a woman who had raised several of her own, and brought a basket of warm bread without being asked. Naomi ate. She did not apologize for being hungry, and Blackburn did not comment on it. He drank coffee and waited, and when she had gotten through most of the bread and a bowl of beef soup, he said, "Tell me about yourself." "Not the advertisement version." She looked up. "There isn't a different version." "There's always a different version." She considered that. "What do you want to know?" "What did you do before Philadelphia, before your husband?" "I grew up in Western Massachusetts," she said. "My father ran a small school. I helped him with it from the time I was 13, teaching the younger children, keeping the records. When he left, I kept doing it on my own until the school board replaced me with someone they considered more suitable." "Who did they consider more suitable?" "A man," she said flatly. Blackburn's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "And then Philadelphia." "And then Philadelphia. I met Thomas there. He was a clerk, worked for an importing firm. He was a good man." She said it simply, without the grief performance that people sometimes expected. "He was kind, and he worked hard, and he got sick, and he died, and I had to figure out what came next." "And what came next was a train to Calverton." "Eventually, yes." He was quiet for a moment. He refilled his coffee from the pot on the table. Della had settled in Naomi's lap, and Rose was awake in the crook of her left arm, chewing on her own fist with great concentration. "Why didn't you lie on the form?" Blackburn said. Naomi looked at him sharply. "The bride's form," he said. "A lot of women do. They simplify, they leave things out. You could have waited until you were already here to mention the babies." "I could have," she said. "Then I would have been here under false pretenses, and the man would have had a legitimate grievance, and I would have been in a worse position than the one I'm already in." She paused. "I don't lie. Not because I'm particularly virtuous, because it doesn't work out. Things catch up." He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "You ran a school," he said. A small one, informally. Can you keep books? Ranch accounts? That kind of thing? She looked at him. Why? Because I need someone who can keep books, he said. And the last 2 people I hired for it robbed me. Naomi looked at him steadily. And the wife part? I'm getting to that. She waited. My ranch, he said, runs about 40,000 acres and close to 2,000 head. I've got 14 full-time hands and another 8 or 10 seasonally. The house is large, too large for one person. I built it for a family and there isn't one. He stopped. I'm 44 years old and I'm not romantic and I'm not easy to live with, and I know both of those things about myself. What I am is honest and I work hard, and I don't expect perfection from other people. He looked at the babies, and I'm not afraid of those girls. Naomi felt something in her chest shift, carefully, cautiously, the way ice shifts in early spring when it's not safe yet, but the thaw has started somewhere underneath. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you sat on that bench for 2 hours after 8 men refused you, and you didn't break, he said. On the frontier, that's considerable information. She looked at him for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackburn? A week, he said. Same as the arrangement was supposed to be. You come to the ranch, you see how it runs, I see how you work. At the end of the week, you decide. And the girls? Bring them, he said, as if this were obvious. Naomi looked down at Della, asleep in her lap. She looked at Rose, still determinedly chewing her own fist. She thought about the $22 in her travel bag, and the eastbound at 7:15 tomorrow morning, and the nothing waiting for her on the other side of that train ride. She thought about Thomas, who had been kind and had not been enough, in the end, to protect them from the difficulty of the world. She thought about what he would say if he could see her now, sitting in an eating house in a frontier town with a stranger who was offering her something that might be real and might be a different kind of disaster. Thomas would have told her to be careful. Thomas would also have told her that being careful had never actually kept anyone safe. 1 week, she said. Blackburn nodded once. I'll have the buckboard ready tomorrow morning. He paid for the meal before she could argue about it, left exact money on the table. Not extravagant, not a demonstration, just the correct amount with a reasonable extra for Agnes's trouble. And he held the door for her when they left, and he did not try to take one of the babies from her arms without asking, which she noticed, and which meant more than he probably knew. They stood in the street outside. His horse was still at the hitching post. His men had ridden back as instructed, and the town was going about its afternoon business around them. 6 o'clock, he said. The buckboard will be at the hotel. Do you have a room? I'll get one. He reached into his jacket and produced a fold of bills. Naomi took a step back. Not charity, he said, before she could speak. Consider it advance wages for the accounting work, if that helps you say yes. She looked at the money. She looked at him. She took the money. It was the most pragmatic decision of her life, and she made it without flinching. And later, much later, she would recognize that as the exact moment things began to change. Not because a man had appeared and saved her, nothing so simple, but because she had stayed on that bench and not collapsed, and she had told the truth on the form and come anyway, and she had sat across a table from a stranger and said, 1 week without letting fear close her mouth. The afternoon sun was falling toward the western hills. Naomi Ashcroft turned and carried her daughters toward the hotel at the end of the main street, and behind her she heard the sound of Wesley Blackburn mounting his horse, and then the rhythm of hooves moving east, and then nothing but the ordinary noise of a frontier town going about its business, indifferent and ongoing, not knowing what it had just witnessed begin. The buckboard arrived at 6 o'clock exactly. Naomi had been awake since 4:30, which was not unusual. Rose and Della kept their own schedule, and it had never once aligned with what adults considered reasonable sleeping hours. She had fed them both, changed them, packed and repacked the travel bag twice, eaten a cold biscuit she'd saved from dinner the night before, and was standing outside the hotel with everything she owned by 5:50. The man driving the buckboard was not Wesley Blackburn. He was a ranch hand, maybe 30, with a weathered face and the particular silence of someone who had been told to pick up a woman and her babies and not ask questions. He introduced himself as Cobb, helped her get the bag loaded without making a production of it, and held the wagon steady while she climbed up with both girls. They rode east for the better part of 2 hours. The land opened up in ways that surprised her. She had grown up in Massachusetts, where hills kept the horizon close and trees filled in what hills didn't. Out here, the sky was enormous, and the land spread itself flat in every direction, and the distance between things was a different kind of distance than she was used to. It made her feel both small and strangely visible, as if she were a detail in a painting that was mostly sky. Cobb didn't talk much. She didn't push him. Della slept the whole ride. Rose sat up in Naomi's lap and watched the world go by with an expression of profound seriousness that sometimes made Naomi wonder what was going on in that small, unreadable mind. The Blackburn Ranch came into view gradually. First a line of fence, then a windmill, turning slowly in the early morning air, then the shape of a large barn, and then the house itself, 2 stories, built from timber and stone, wider than it was tall, with a long covered porch running across the front. It was not a beautiful house in any ornamental sense. It was a house built to last, which was its own kind of statement. Wesley Blackburn was standing on the porch when the buckboard pulled up. He looked like he'd already been working for hours, which he probably had. He came down the porch steps without hurrying and said good morning in a way that was neither overly warm nor dismissive, just direct, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he spoke. "How were the roads?" he said to Cobb. "Dry," Cobb said. Blackburn looked at Naomi. "Sleep?" "Some," she said. He nodded as if this were a full and satisfying answer, then reached up for the travel bag before she could get to it. "Mrs. Garrett will show you the rooms," he said. "Take an hour, settle the girls. The ranch can wait an hour." Mrs. Garrett turned out to be a stout woman in her late 50s who ran the household with the calm efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that most problems were solvable if you approached them practically, and most people were tolerable if you didn't expect too much from them. She showed Naomi to a room on the 2nd floor, a genuine room, not a closet, with a window that faced south and a crib someone had already set up near the wall. Naomi stood in the doorway and looked at the crib for a moment. "He had Cobb bring it down from the storage room this morning," Mrs. Garrett said, with the neutral tone of someone reporting a weather condition. "Early, around 5. Naomi didn't say anything to that. She walked in and put Rose down, and Rose immediately grabbed the crib rail and pulled herself up and stood there swaying with an expression of tremendous satisfaction, because standing while holding something was her current greatest achievement, and she practiced it every chance she got. "She stands already?" Mrs. Garrett said. "Constantly," Naomi said. "She'd stand in her sleep if she could figure out how." Mrs. Garrett made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction, and left them to it. The hour Blackburn had offered turned into 40 minutes because Naomi was not built for sitting still when there was something to understand. She came downstairs to find him at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him, and 2 ranch hands waiting near the back door with the look of men who had questions they needed answered before the morning got away from them. He dealt with the hands quickly, 3 sentences each, no wasted words, and then looked up at Naomi. "You want to see the books first, or the operation?" "The operation," she said. "I can read numbers on a page anywhere. I can't read a ranch from a page." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd already half expected. "Cobb," he called. Cobb materialized from somewhere near the barn. "Mrs. Ashcroft needs someone to watch the girls for a few hours. Find May." May turned out to be a young Mexican woman who worked in the house and had, by her own immediate and enthusiastic declaration, 6 younger brothers and sisters back home, and was not remotely intimidated by 2 8-month-olds. She took Della from Naomi's arms with a practiced ease that immediately made Della stop fussing, which Naomi privately found slightly offensive and enormously reassuring at the same time. She spent the morning with Blackburn. He showed her the operation the way a man shows someone something he's built. Not boasting, but thorough. He wanted her to understand it. The cattle operation, the rotation of grazing areas, the water situation, which was always the situation on the frontier, the hay supply for winter, the bunkhouse conditions, the equipment. He introduced her to his foreman, a lean, sun-damaged man named Rudolph Hatch, who shook her hand with the careful politeness of a man who had reservations he was choosing not to express. She asked questions. Real ones, not the polite kind. She asked about the accounting system, and Blackburn explained it, and she spotted 2 inefficiencies in how the seasonal labor costs were being tracked before they'd even gotten back to the house. "You're recording day wages and contract work in the same column," she said. That's going to give you a distorted picture of what your actual fixed costs are versus variable. Blackburn looked at her. It means when you're trying to budget for next year, she said, you can't easily separate what you'll definitely spend from what might vary depending on how the season goes. I know what it means, he said mildly. She felt heat rise slightly in her face. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize for being right, he said. It's a habit worth breaking. She pressed her mouth together and said nothing, and they kept walking. The afternoon was harder. She hadn't anticipated how physically demanding the week would be, not because she was unused to work, but because she had spent 8 months doing most of her work one-handed, the other hand always occupied by a baby. Working with both hands free felt strange and slightly guilty, even with May clearly managing Rose and Della without distress. She helped in the kitchen with Mrs. Garrett, who tested her without appearing to, assigning tasks and watching from the corner of her eye to see how they were handled. Naomi peeled, chopped, lifted, hauled water, and did not complain, and did not try to make conversation she didn't mean. After 2 hours of this, Mrs. Garrett said, without preamble, "You've done kitchen work before." "My whole life," Naomi said. "You don't resent it." "I resent some of it," Naomi said honestly, "but not the work itself. The work is fine." Mrs. Garrett looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still carefully neutral, then handed her a paring knife and a basket of potatoes, and that was apparently all she had to say on the subject. Dinner that first evening was eaten at the big table in the ranch house. Blackburn, Naomi, Mrs. Garrett, Hatch the foreman, and 2 of the senior hands. It was a louder meal than Naomi expected. The men talked over each other, argued about a fence line in the north pasture, discussed the market price for beef with the urgency of men for whom it was not abstract. Blackburn participated but did not dominate. He had the habit of asking questions rather than stating opinions, which was, Naomi thought, a more intelligent way to run a conversation than most men ever figured out. She sat with Della on her lap. Rose had crashed spectacularly after May's afternoon of entertainment and was asleep upstairs, and ate and listened and answered when spoken to, and said things she actually meant rather than things designed to make people like her. Hatch, across the table, watched her with the assessing look of a man deciding whether to trust something new. She watched him back equally. At one point he said directly, "You know anything about cattle?" "Almost nothing," Naomi said. "At least you know what you don't know," Hatch said. It was not warm, but it was a point in her direction. After dinner, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Garrett had retired and the house was quiet, Blackburn poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, and sat down across the table. "First day," he said. "First day," she agreed. He looked at Della, asleep now in the crook of Naomi's left arm. "She sleep through the night?" "Sometimes, Rose less so." "I didn't hear anything last night," he said. "I keep them quiet," Naomi said. "I've gotten good at it. I didn't want to—" She stopped. "To bother anyone," he finished. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "This is your room too if you stay, not a guest room. Yours. The girls can cry." She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked at her coffee and said, "Thank you." They were quiet for a moment. "You spotted the accounting problem this morning in about 10 minutes, he said. "It was fairly obvious once I understood the structure." "The man I had doing the books before didn't spot it in 2 years, Blackburn said. "And he wasn't stealing, he was just not very good at it." 2 years of skewed data, Naomi said. "Do you want me to look at it properly? Work backward and see if I can reconstruct cleaner figures?" "Is that something you can do?" "It'll take time, but yes." He nodded. "We can start on that tomorrow if you want." She looked at him. "I haven't decided to stay yet." "I know," he said. He said it without any particular pressure in it. She appreciated that, more than she expected to. The second day was rougher than the first, and not because of the work. It started in the morning when Cobb brought news from town. He'd ridden in for supplies and come back with what he'd heard, which was that people were talking. The mail-order bride that Wesley Blackburn had taken home. The widow with the 2 babies. The way people said it was not kind. Naomi heard some of it secondhand through May, who repeated it with visible discomfort, clearly uncertain whether to tell her. "Tell me," Naomi said. May told her. The content was what she expected. That Naomi must have done something clever to get Blackburn's attention. that no sensible man brought a woman with 2 infants home for a trial week, that she was probably good-looking enough to have turned his head, and that men, even smart ones, were led around by a particular part of their anatomy rather than their judgment. None of it surprised her. All of it landed anyway, in that specific place where she kept the things she pretended not to feel. She was in the middle of working through the second year of the ledgers when Blackburn came in and found her at the desk with papers arranged in a system he hadn't been able to follow at a glance. "You've heard what they're saying in town," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly heard something too. "Yes," Naomi said. "Does it change anything for you?" She thought about it honestly. "It makes things harder," she said, "if I stay. There'll be people who never see me as anything other than what they've already decided I am." "That's true," he said. "You knew that before you brought me here." "Yes." She looked at him. "And it doesn't concern you?" "People have been deciding what I am since I was 20, he said. "Mostly they've been wrong. I found it's easier to stop waiting for their approval." "It's easier to stop waiting for approval," she said, "when you have the kind of name and property that means you don't actually need it." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her at the desk. "That's fair," he said. "I won't pretend the position is the same." She turned back to the ledger. It was the most honest conversation she'd had with a man who wasn't Thomas in a very long time, and that fact itself was unsettling. The third day brought the first real test of a different kind. Naomi was out near the south barn in the early afternoon when a rider came up the road and pulled up to the fence with the ease of a man who had done it often. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy-set, wearing a coat that cost more than most of the hands earned in a month. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the evaluating look of a man who had decided she was a novelty to be assessed. "You're the widow," he said. "I'm Naomi Ashcroft," she said. "Arthur Langley," he said. "I've got the property that borders Blackburn's to the north." He didn't get down from his horse. "Didn't expect Wes to bring a woman home this year. He's turned down every bride candidate for 4 years running." "I'm not sure why you're telling me this," Naomi said. Langley smiled. It was the kind of smile that was more about the man doing the smiling than any warmth toward the person receiving it. "Just making conversation," he said. "I'd be curious to know what you said to him on that platform." "I told him my name," Naomi said, "and that my husband had been dead 14 months. That was about the extent of it." Langley's smile got slightly fixed. He had expected her to be flattered by his attention, she realized, or at least flustered by it. She was neither. "Well," he said, "we'll see how the week goes." He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and Naomi watched him go and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but was somewhere between the two. She told Blackburn about it at dinner. She told him directly, the way she'd already begun to understand he preferred things. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Langley has been trying to buy my north pasture for 8 years. He comes by every few months on one pretext or another." "He came to look at me," Naomi said. "Yes, he did." "Why?" Blackburn was quiet for a moment. "Because men like Langley think information is leverage. He wanted to see what kind of woman he was dealing with." "And what did he find out?" Blackburn looked at her across the table. "I imagine he found out that you're not easy to rattle," he said, "which will either put him off or make him more interested, depending on what he thinks he can use." Naomi filed that away and said nothing more about it. The fourth day was the one she almost left. It happened in a way she hadn't predicted. Rose had a difficult night, a tooth coming, nothing serious but painful enough to keep her awake and crying for most of the hours between midnight and 4. Naomi handled it, as she always did, in the rocking chair in her room with Rose pressed against her shoulder and the low, wordless hum she'd developed over 8 months that seemed to be the only sound that reliably helped. She had been at the chair for 2 hours when the door opened quietly and Wesley Blackburn stood in the doorway in his work clothes, which told her he'd been up already. He started his mornings before 4. He looked at her. He looked at Rose. He said very quietly, "You need anything?" And for reasons she could not have fully articulated, the question itself, the lateness, the fact that he was standing in a doorway at 4 in the morning, not to make himself useful in any dramatic way, but simply to ask, she felt the long-suppressed exhaustion of 14 months rise up in her throat and very nearly choke her. She got herself under control in about 4 seconds. He saw it happen. He didn't say anything about it. "I'm fine," she said. He stood there a moment longer. Then he said, "There's coffee when you're ready," and left, and pulled the door shut quietly behind him. She sat there with Rose going gradually slack against her shoulder and thought about leaving. Not in the panicked way she'd thought about it in Philadelphia. This was quieter than that. She thought about how much easier it would be, in certain respects, to go east and find a city and a small room and a piece of work and manage on her own terms without owing anything to anyone. She had managed for 14 months. She could continue to manage. Then she thought about Rose, about Della, about the crib Blackburn had brought down from storage at 5 in the morning, about the way he'd watched her handle the ledgers with a look that was not condescension and not excessive admiration, but just attention, real attention, the kind that meant something. She thought about Thomas and what Thomas had given her and what he hadn't been able to. He had loved her well and left her nothing, not by intention, but by circumstance. Naomi had survived that. She had kept her feet under her and kept her daughters alive and found her way to this room in this house, in this territory, and she was tired in her bones, and there was a man downstairs who had asked her, at 4 in the morning, if she needed anything. She put Rose down in the crib at 4:30. Rose stayed down. Naomi washed her face and went downstairs. Blackburn was at the kitchen table with coffee and the ledger she'd been working on, though he wasn't reading it so much as sitting with it while he thought about something else. He looked up when she came in. He poured her a cup without speaking and pushed it across the table. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the dark was just beginning to consider changing. She could hear the first sounds from the barn, animals stirring, one of the early hands moving around. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When Thomas died," she said, "I thought the hardest thing I would ever do was stay standing in that churchyard while they put him in the ground. I was 8 months pregnant and it was cold, and I didn't have anyone with me, and I stood there and made myself stay standing." She looked at her coffee. "And then the girls came, and every week since then has been harder than that day. So when people say I'm brave, people don't say it to me directly, but I hear it secondhand, I want to say that it's not bravery, it's just that I don't know how to stop." Blackburn looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I think you should know who you're actually considering. I'm not a heroic woman. I'm a tired woman who keeps moving because stopping seems worse." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know a lot of men who'd fall apart in half those circumstances. That's not the point I'm making. I know, but it's the one I'm making." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I don't want a heroic woman. I want a real one. There's a difference." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the dark was turning the color of slate, which meant morning was 20 minutes away. She said, "I think I'm going to stay." He nodded, once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already half known. "Good," he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't make a speech about it. He poured himself more coffee and turned back to the ledger and asked her, businesslike, "You said there were 3 years of distorted figures. Do you want to start with the earliest year or work backward from the most recent?" "Backward," she said. "The recent errors are the ones affecting current decisions." "Then let's start there." And that was how the 5th morning at Blackburn Ranch began. Not with romance or declarations, but with 2 people at a kitchen table in the early dark, working through numbers together, while 2 babies slept upstairs. The whole arrangement messy and uncertain, and nothing like any story Naomi had ever read about how a life was supposed to go. And somehow, because of all that, more solid than anything she had felt in a very long time. But the 5th day was the day Naomi understood the full shape of what she was walking into. And it was not as simple as she had let herself begin to believe. It started with a visit she had not been told was coming. A carriage arrived mid-morning, and out of it stepped 2 women. The first was perhaps 50, thin and straight-backed, wearing clothes that would have been fashionable in any eastern city and were here a demonstration of something. The second was younger, mid-20s, dark-haired, pretty in a careful, deliberate way. They walked up to the porch with the confidence of people who expected to be expected. Mrs. Garrett let them in with an expression that told Naomi everything she needed to know about how these visitors were regarded in this house. They were tolerated, not welcomed. The older woman was introduced as Margaret Bellard. The younger was her daughter, Clara. They were from a prominent family in the nearest large town, some 40 miles east. They took chairs in the front parlor and accepted tea and looked at Naomi with the particular attention of women who are cataloging everything about you while pretending to make pleasant conversation. "So you're the woman Wesley brought home," Margaret Bellard said, with a smile that was all surface and nothing underneath. "Naomi Ashcroft," Naomi said. Margaret looked at her hands, which showed the work she'd been doing that morning. "And you have children? 2, I hear." "2 daughters," Naomi said, 8 months old." "How remarkable," Margaret said, in a tone that made the word mean its exact opposite. Clara Bellard had been quiet up until this point, looking at her tea. Now she looked up and looked at Naomi, and Naomi read in her face something that surprised her. Not hostility, exactly, but a specific kind of unhappy resignation, the look of a person being used in a situation they did not choose. "Has Mr. Blackburn talked to you about the North Pasture?" Margaret said, pivoting with the abruptness of someone who had been waiting to ask. Naomi looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "The North Pasture, the land dispute with the Langley property. It's been an ongoing issue and there's a resolution being discussed that involves—" Margaret paused as if choosing her words carefully. "Various interested parties." "I'm not familiar with any dispute," Naomi said honestly. "Well," Margaret set down her teacup, "I imagine you have a great deal to learn about the ranch. In the short time you're here." The phrase "in the short time you're here" landed with the precision of something thrown to land exactly where it did. Naomi looked at Margaret Bellard and kept her face as neutral as she could manage. "Is there something specific you wanted to say to me, Mrs. Bellard?" she said. The older woman's expression flickered, genuine surprise, quickly controlled. She had expected flustered. She was getting direct. "I simply want you to understand," Margaret said, "that there are arrangements in this territory that have been in place for some time. Wesley is a man of importance here, and the alliances around his property and his personal situation have implications that go beyond a week's visit from a mail-order bride." "You think I'll take his attention from someone else?" Naomi said. Silence. Clara Bellard looked up from her tea, and now what was in her face was not resignation, but something close to guilt. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that Wesley has always been pragmatic. And pragmatic men sometimes make impulsive decisions that they later— I think," Naomi said just as carefully, "that you've come here to tell me something without quite saying it, and I'll save you some effort." She set down her own cup. "I haven't made any decisions. Neither has Mr. Blackburn, officially. There's still 2 days of the week remaining. Whatever arrangements exist in this territory are between the people who made them, and I'm not in a position to affect any of that, unless I'm made an offer and choose to accept it, which hasn't happened." She looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her, and something in the younger woman's eyes shifted. A small, complicated thing. Recognition, maybe. "So," Naomi said, "is there anything else?" Margaret Bellard stood. She had the controlled fury of a woman who was accustomed to winning this kind of exchange and had not won this one. "I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit," she said, making visit into a small weapon. "Thank you for coming," Naomi said. They left. Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds after the carriage had pulled away, holding a dish towel and wearing an expression of deeply suppressed satisfaction. "Mrs. Garrett," Naomi said, "who is Clara Bellard to Mr. Blackburn?" Mrs. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "The Bellards have been pushing a match for 3 years," she said. "Mr. Blackburn has not been interested. Mrs. Bellard has not accepted that fact." "And the North Pasture?" "Arthur Langley and the Bellard family have a business arrangement," Mrs. Garrett said. "If Langley gets the North Pasture and the Bellard girl marries Wes, it creates a land situation that benefits both families considerably." She paused. "At Wes's expense." Naomi looked at the empty parlor doorway. "He knows this?" "He's known it for 2 years," Mrs. Garrett said. "He's a stubborn man, not a stupid one." Naomi sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, she found Blackburn at the fence near the south pasture, watching the cattle settle for the night the way ranchers watch things. Not anxiously, but with the constant low-level attention of a man for whom the state of his herd was a kind of ongoing conversation. She walked up beside him and leaned on the fence rail and said, "The Bellard women came today." "I heard. Margaret Bellard seems to believe there are arrangements involving your North Pasture and her daughter." "Margaret Bellard? Blackburn said, believes a great many things about what concerns her that don't actually concern her. She came here because of me, Naomi said. My being here has disturbed something. He was quiet. I'm not saying that as a complaint, she said. I'm saying it because I think you should tell me what I'm walking into, if I'm walking into it. He turned and looked at her. The evening light was coming in low and copper-colored, and it made everything look like a painting of itself. Langley wants my north pasture because it controls access to the water rights for the upper creek, he said. The Bellards want a connection to my ranch because it would give them financial stability they currently don't have, despite what their clothes suggest. If I married Clara Bellard, Margaret would consider it a business arrangement. She's not entirely wrong about that. That's what it would be. He paused. I don't want a business arrangement. I want what I told you at the table in Agnes Hartley's place. She looked at the cattle. She looked at the fence. She thought about the fence in Calverton she'd counted during Clifford Hayes's cruelty, and how she'd gotten here from there in 5 days. A real woman, she said. Yes. She turned that over. That's a complicated thing to promise someone who's been refused by 8 men in a single morning. He looked at her steadily. You're still here. She thought about Rose at 4 a.m, and Della's fist in her mouth on the platform, and the $22, and the crib brought down from storage in the dark. I'm still here, she agreed. They stood at the fence in the evening quiet, not touching, not making any declarations, the land spreading out enormous and darkening around them. And Naomi felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it, the particular sensation of the ground becoming more solid under your feet after a very long time of not knowing how much weight it would hold. The week still had 2 days left, and somewhere to the north, Arthur Langley was riding the fence line of a pasture he wanted, and Margaret Bellard was in a carriage going home with a face full of calculations, and the town of Calverton was talking about all 3 of them in ways none of them had approved. None of that had resolved itself. None of it would resolve easily. Naomi had been on this ranch for 5 days, and she had fixed a 2-year accounting error and held a colicky baby through the small hours, and sat across from a woman who came to frighten her off and had not been frightened. She had done it all imperfectly, with tired hands and not enough sleep, and a temper she kept control of through effort rather than nature. And she had done it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. Whatever came next was going to require the same. She had no illusions about that. But standing at the fence in the copper evening, with the sound of cattle settling nearby, and the man beside her saying nothing because he was a person who understood that silence was sometimes the most complete thing you could offer, she did not feel alone in it. That was not nothing. After 14 months, that was in fact quite a lot. The 6th day arrived without ceremony, the way days on the frontier always did, not with drama, but with light, pale and flat, coming over the eastern ridge before most people were ready for it. Naomi had slept 4 consecutive hours, which felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. Rose had gone down without fighting. Della had woken once, briefly, and gone back down with almost no coaxing, which was unusual enough that Naomi lay awake for 20 minutes afterward, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't. She slept. She came downstairs to find Blackburn already gone from the house. She could hear him out near the barn, a low exchange with Hatch about something involving the north fence, and Mrs. Garrett at the stove, and a mug of coffee sitting on the table in the spot where Naomi had sat every morning that week, as if it had always been her spot, as if that had been decided quietly, without anyone making an announcement. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the mug and thought about what she'd told Blackburn at the fence the night before. I'm still here. She had meant it as a statement of fact. She was beginning to understand that it was also a choice she was remaking every morning, not once and finally, but continuously, the way you kept your balance, not by standing perfectly still, but by constant small adjustments you didn't even fully notice yourself making. The Bellard carriage went through town yesterday evening, Mrs. Garrett said, not looking up from the stove. I imagine it did, Naomi said. Margaret Bellard talks to 3 women who talk to 30. Mrs. Garrett turned a piece of salt pork with a fork. By this morning, half the town will have an opinion about you. Half the town already has an opinion about me, Naomi said. They formed it on the platform. Mrs. Garrett glanced at her sideways. This will be a louder opinion. Naomi drank her coffee. The sixth day was a Saturday, which meant the hands who were off rotation would ride into Calverton for supplies and whatever the town offered in the way of company on a Saturday evening. Naomi had no particular reason to go to town and several practical reasons not to. She stayed at the ranch, worked through the third year of ledgers, and tried not to think about what was being said in Calverton's two saloons and its mercantile and its barber shop and wherever else the men of the territory gathered to discuss things that weren't their business. She mostly succeeded. Cobb came back from town at 4 in the afternoon with a wagon load of supplies and the expression of a man carrying news he hadn't asked to carry. He found Blackburn near the equipment barn and said something in a low voice that Naomi, crossing the yard with Della on her hip, caught the edge of but not the substance. She watched Blackburn's face. His jaw moved slightly, the small, controlled adjustment of a man receiving information that was unpleasant and choosing not to show how unpleasant. He looked at her across the yard. "What happened?" she said. He walked over. "Langley was at the mercantile this morning," he said. "He said some things. About me. About the situation." He paused. He suggested that a mail-order widow with 2 infants was a poor match for a ranch of this size and that any man seriously considering it ought to have his judgment examined. He looked at her steadily while he said it, the way a person looks at someone when they want to monitor the impact of difficult information. Naomi shifted Della to her other hip. And Hayes was there. He repeated his comment from the platform, apparently. There was some general agreement. She was quiet for a moment. Was anyone there who disagreed? Blackburn was quiet for a slightly longer moment. Doc Pembridge said he thought it was none of their business, but Pembridge says that about most things, so it didn't carry much. Naomi looked out toward the east road, the direction of town. She thought about the platform. She thought about 7 rejections and Clifford Hayes in the 8 position of "I ordered a wife," not a charity case. She had survived that. She could survive people talking in a mercantile. What she was less certain she could survive was this, the understanding, arriving now with full clarity, that if she stayed, if she accepted what Blackburn was offering, she would spend the foreseeable future being the subject of this kind of conversation. Not for a week or a month, perhaps for years. The widow who trapped Wesley Blackburn. The woman who brought 2 babies that weren't his blood and somehow convinced the richest rancher in 3 territories to call them his own. Every success of the ranch would be attributed to him. Every difficulty would be attributed to her. She had known this, theoretically. She was understanding it now in her body, which was a different kind of knowing. "I need to think," she said. "All right," he said. He didn't ask what she needed to think about. He just stepped back and gave her the space to do it, which was one of the things she was coming to rely on without meaning to. She walked to the far side of the yard, Della still on her hip, and stood looking at the open land to the south. Della reached up and grabbed a strand of Naomi's hair and pulled it with the enthusiastic thoughtlessness of a baby who had no concept of cause and effect yet. Naomi untangled it without looking down, mechanically, and kept looking at the horizon. Thomas had never let anyone speak ill of her. That was one of the things she had loved most about him. His quick, unthinking defense of her, the way he'd put himself between her and unkindness without calculation. He'd been gone 14 months, and she still felt his absence like a missing step in a staircase, that half-second of expecting solid ground and finding nothing. But Thomas was gone, and the world had not become kinder in his absence. And standing here thinking about him wasn't going to solve the problem of Arthur Langley in a mercantile, or Margaret Bellard in a carriage, or Clifford Hayes repeating himself for an audience. She turned around and walked back. Blackburn was where she'd left him. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not staying because I'm afraid of going. I have options, limited ones, but they exist. I'm staying because I think this is worth the difficulty." She held his gaze. "But I need to know that you won't change your mind when it gets harder, because it's going to get harder." He looked at her for a long moment. "I brought you here knowing Langley was a problem," he said. "I brought you here knowing the Bellards had expectations. I brought you here knowing the town would talk." He paused. "I don't make decisions I'm not prepared to stand behind." "Even when it costs you?" "Especially then," he said. "Otherwise the decision didn't mean anything." She looked at him. She believed him. She was not entirely sure if that was wisdom or desperation, but she believed him. "All right," she said. The seventh and final day of the trial week was a Sunday. Naomi woke before the light and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of both girls' breathing. Della's regular and deep, Rose's slightly more irregular, prone to small snuffling interruptions that never quite woke her. She had spent 8 months listening to those sounds. She had learned to read them the way sailors read water. She made her decision that morning not as a single dramatic moment, but as the quiet conclusion of a process that had been running all week. She lay in the dark and let herself look at it directly, which was her way with difficult things. She did not embroider it. She did not make it more romantic than it was. The facts were, she had come here with nothing, and she had spent a week learning that this man was what he said he was, which was rare and therefore significant. He was not easy. He was not warm in any obvious way. But he was honest, and he was consistent, and he had brought down a crib from the storage room at 5 in the morning for babies he had never met. And he had sat with her in the kitchen at 4 in the morning and asked if she needed anything and accepted, "I'm fine without pushing," and those things had accumulated into something she trusted in the way she trusted load-bearing walls. Not because they were beautiful, but because they held. She got up. She fed the girls. She went downstairs. He was at the table, coffee on both sides. "I've made my decision," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Not wonderful, or "I'm so glad," or any of the things a man in a story would say. Just good, in that same quiet, certain voice, and she found she preferred it to any of those things. "I have conditions," she said. He waited. "The girls are not to be treated as secondary to any other consideration in this house. Not guests, not charity. If you introduce them to people, they are your daughters. If people ask about their father, the answer is that you are their father." He nodded. "Agreed. I want full responsibility for the ranch accounts. Not assistance, responsibility. If there's a disagreement about a financial decision, I want a seat at the table where it's made." "Agreed. And if you decide at any point that this arrangement isn't working, for any reason, including ones you don't want to explain, you tell me directly. Not through Mrs. Garrett, not by becoming cold and waiting for me to understand the implication. You tell me." He looked at her. "I'll do the same for you." "Fair," she said. She sat down and picked up her coffee. He turned back to the ledger on the table, which was the third year's accounts she'd been reconstructing, and said, "I found something in the August figures you should see." And that was how the arrangement began. Not with ceremony, but with two people sitting at a table and working on a problem together, which was, in its way, the most honest proposal either of them had ever been part of. They rode into Calverton together 3 days later to see Judge Harold Renfrew, who handled civil matters in that part of the territory and had married more frontier couples than he could count. The ceremony, such as it was, happened in his office. Naomi, Wesley, Mrs. Garrett as witness, Cobb as the second. Rose sat on Mrs. Garrett's knee and chewed on a button. Della fell asleep halfway through and had to be held upright. Renfrew was a dry, efficient man who took 11 minutes from beginning to end and then shook both their hands and said, "Congratulations, I suppose," which was the most accurate thing anyone had said about the situation. They drove back to the ranch in the buckboard. Naomi held both girls. Blackburn drove. Neither of them said very much. There was, strangely, not much that needed to be said. They had already talked through the things that mattered. What remained was the living of it. That was where the real difficulty began. Not between them, not at first. Between them and the world. Calverton's response to this marriage was swift and varied, and none of it was asked for. The approval came from unexpected places. Agnes Hartley at the eating house sent over a pie, which was a more meaningful gesture than it might sound because Agnes Hartley did not send pies to people she didn't respect. Doc Pembridge congratulated Blackburn at the feed store and said, with his usual bluntness, "About time you made a sensible choice," which was the warmest thing Pembridge said to anyone. The disapproval came from the expected places and a few unexpected ones. The wives of 3 of the more prominent ranching families made their feelings known through the reliable frontier method of conspicuous absence. They had been to the Blackburn Ranch before, occasional social calls, and they stopped coming. The message was clear enough without being stated. Clifford Hayes said something in the saloon on a Wednesday night that got repeated to Blackburn by Thursday morning. He had called Naomi a schemer. He had suggested the babies were a calculated prop. He had used language that Cobb, repeating it, edited considerably, his eyes not quite meeting anyone's. Blackburn listened to this report and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said to Cobb, "Thank you," and went back to work. He did not ride into town to confront Hayes. Naomi, when she found out about it, had a complicated reaction to that. Part of her wanted the confrontation, the dramatic clearing of the air that stories promised and life rarely delivered. But she understood, even in that wanting, that a confrontation with Hayes would make her the cause of a problem rather than the target of one, would make Blackburn look reactive, would give Langley and the Billards a narrative to work with. She understood this, but still, on that Thursday evening, she was shorter-tempered than usual. She snapped at May over something that didn't merit it and then immediately regretted it. She put the wrong figures in a column of accounts and didn't catch it for 20 minutes. She burned the corner of her hand on the stove and said a word under her breath that she wouldn't have said in company. Blackburn found her at the desk at 9 o'clock, the hand wrapped in a cloth, the ledger open to the page she'd been correcting. "You've heard about Hayes," he said. "Yes." He sat down. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," she said. Then, "Yes. I don't know." She put the pen down. "I know it shouldn't affect me more than the platform did. I was there for Hayes on the platform. I survived that." "But this is different," Blackburn said. "Not a question." "This is different because now it's not just me he's dismissing," she said. "It's Rose and Della, calling them a prop." She said the word with a controlled flatness that was doing a great deal of work. "They are 8-month-old children who did not ask to be born into difficult circumstances, and they have never harmed anyone." She stopped. The anger was real, and she was not quite managing to keep it from her voice, which she noticed and didn't fully correct, because he had asked her to talk about it, and this was the honest version. "Hayes is a small man," Blackburn said. "Not in size, in character." "I know that." "Knowing it doesn't make it hurt less," he said. She looked at him. He was right, and she was mildly surprised that he'd said it. She had expected either dismissal or the kind of pragmatic advice that skipped over the actual feeling. "No," she said. "It doesn't." "I can't stop what people say," he said. "I can make clear, in settings where it matters, what my position is. I've been doing that." "I know you have." She took a breath. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I needed to say it out loud to someone." "Then say it," he said. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the cloth around her hand. She thought about Della's expression on the platform, watching the stranger with uncomplicated attention. She thought about Rose standing in the crib, swaying with satisfaction. "I am angry," she said clearly, "at every person in this territory who has looked at my daughters and seen a liability instead of two human beings. I am angry at Hayes, and I am angry at Langley, and I'm angry at Margaret Bellard, and I'm angry at the 6 men on that platform who walked away without a word of apology, and I am especially angry at myself for letting any of it get under my skin when I should be used to it by now." The last sentence cracked slightly at the end. She tightened her jaw and held the rest of it back. Blackburn said nothing for a moment. Then, "You shouldn't have to be used to it." She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in front of him. She had decided that back on the platform, and she was keeping it. "No," she said, when she trusted her voice again. "But I am." He reached across the table and put his hand briefly on top of hers. The unhurt one, her right hand flat against the desk. He didn't squeeze or hold it, just set his hand down for a moment and then took it back. It was such a plain, undemonstrative gesture that she almost missed what it cost him, because she was learning that Wesley Blackburn was not a man who touched people easily, and so when he did, it meant something specific. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm riding into town to deal with a land matter. I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'd like people to see us," he said, "not performing anything, just together." She understood. "All right." They rode in the next morning, Naomi on the horse. Blackburn had designated for her use a steady quarter horse named Birch, who had the temperament of an experienced nurse, patient and reliable and quietly alert. May had the girls. The ride to town took 40 minutes, and they talked on and off about the accounts and about the water rights situation and about a letter Blackburn had received from his lawyer in Kansas City about the Langley matter, which was apparently more legally complex than it had first appeared. Calverton in the mid-morning had the unhurried busyness of a frontier town on a weekday. Wagons on the main road, the sound of hammering from somewhere near the south end, the smell of bread from the baker's shop 2 doors down from Agnes Hartley's place. People noticed them, not all at once, and not dramatically. This wasn't a story where the whole town stopped and stared, but eyes tracked them, heads turned, and then turned away, and turned back. The mercantile, where Naomi needed thread and a few other things, had 4 women in it when they walked in, and the conversation stopped for approximately 3 seconds before resuming, slightly louder and more deliberate than before. Blackburn stayed near the door while she went to the counter, not hovering, not absent, present, in a way that was visible without being theatrical. The woman behind the counter was named Ruth Alcott, and she had the practical, unornamented manner of someone who had been dealing with other people's business for long enough to find it tedious. She took Naomi's list, gathered the items, named the price. While she did this, one of the women near the fabric bolts, Naomi had not learned her name, said something to the woman beside her in a voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Bold, I'll give her that." Naomi paid Ruth Alcott the exact amount. Ruth Alcott gave her the change and then, without looking at the woman near the fabric bolts, said to Naomi with matter-of-fact clarity, "My cousin married a widower with 4 children. People talked for 2 years. After that, they talked about something else. They always do." It was the most unexpected kindness Naomi had received from a stranger in longer than she could clearly remember. She held it together long enough to say thank you and walked to the door. And then Blackburn held it open for her, and they walked out into the clear morning, and she took one full breath of outside air and settled herself. "Ruth Alcott," she said. "Good woman," Blackburn said. "Her cousin married Frank Delacroix over in Mill Creek, if you were wondering. 4 children and another 2 since. They're doing fine." She looked at him. "You knew she'd say that?" "I thought she might," he said. "Ruth Alcott says what she thinks, and what she thinks is usually right." She absorbed this. He had chosen the mercantile deliberately. He had known what Ruth Alcott was likely to say. He had done all of this without telling her because if he'd told her, it would have felt managed, and managed things had a way of being less true. She was not entirely sure whether to be grateful or annoyed. She decided on both in roughly equal measure. "That was somewhat calculated," she said. "Everything I do is somewhat calculated," he said without apology. "I told you I wasn't easy." She almost smiled. They were walking back toward the hitching post when they encountered Arthur Langley. He came out of the land office on the opposite side of the street, saw them, and for a half second, just a half second, she saw him calculate. Then he crossed the road toward them with the smooth confidence of a man who had decided that direct was better than avoidance. "Wes," he said, "and Mrs. Blackburn." He said her new name with a specific quality, neither rude nor warm, the tone of a man tasting something unfamiliar and not committed on whether he liked it. "Langley," Blackburn said, "I hear you went to see Renfrew." Langley's eyes moved to Naomi for a moment, a quick assessment. "Quick work." "When something's right, there's no point in delay," Blackburn said. Langley's mouth moved toward a smile that didn't quite get there. "I've been thinking about our ongoing conversation," he said, "about the North Pasture. Perhaps it's time to sit down with our lawyers and find a proper resolution." "I have a lawyer," Blackburn said. "In Kansas City. He'll be in contact." "I'd prefer to handle things locally." "I'm sure you would," Blackburn said pleasantly. Langley looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Naomi, and his expression shifted into something that was almost, not quite, but almost, respectful. She had the impression that he had come prepared for a different kind of woman. He had expected someone to manage, and he had found someone who was watching him with a level, patient attention that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, "I hope you'll be happy here." "I intend to be," she said. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and walked on. Naomi and Blackburn walked to their horses. "That was different from the fence visit," she said. "He's reassessing," Blackburn said. "Good. Don't enjoy it too much. Men like Langley don't stop because they've been surprised. They adjust." "I know," she said. "I'm not celebrating. I'm noting a shift." He looked at her as they reached the horses. "You're quick," he said. "I've had to be," she said. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning, and the day was clear and the road was dry, and the mountains to the west were sitting blue and enormous against the sky, the way mountains did when the air was cold enough to make distances sharp. And Naomi rode Birch without difficulty and thought about the land office where Langley had just been, and what business he'd been conducting there, and filed the question away for later. There was a great deal to file away for later. That was the nature of what she'd walked into. Not a simple arrangement, but a complex one, with history. She was still learning, and people whose movements she was still mapping. She was good at that kind of learning. She had done it her whole life. The school records for her father, the accounts for the Market Street shop in Philadelphia, the Blackburn Ranch ledgers. Patterns of information, assembled slowly into something coherent. The Blackburn Ranch, she was beginning to understand, was a place where the financial problems and the social problems were connected in ways that Blackburn himself might not have fully mapped, because he was a man who operated in the terrain he could see and trusted that he could handle what appeared. He was not wrong about his own capability, but there were things being moved around him that benefited from a person who could look at a pattern of numbers and understand what they implied. She was that person. She was beginning to understand that being that person, in this place, might turn out to matter more than anyone standing on that platform had imagined when they watched her be rejected 8 consecutive times. The trouble that had been gathering, the Langley situation, the Bellard calculations, the whispers that moved through Calverton like weather, had not resolved itself. It had simply shifted, the way a storm shifts when the wind changes direction. The eye was moving. Where it would make landfall was not yet clear. What became clear, 3 days after the trip to town, was that Arthur Langley's visit to the land office had been about more than an ongoing conversation. Cobb brought the information back from a Saturday run. He had a talent for absorbing the things people said when they thought they were only being overheard by someone unimportant. What he'd heard was this: Langley had filed an amended claim on a water easement that, if registered, would give him legal access rights to the upper creek that crossed the northern boundary of Blackburn land. The easement had existed in some form for years, but had never been formally claimed. By filing now, Langley was not buying the north pasture. He was making the north pasture less valuable without paying anything for it. Blackburn read the paper Cobb had copied down. A partial description of the filing, obtained from someone in the land office who had been more forthcoming than they probably should have been. And his face went very still in the way Naomi had come to recognize as his version of controlled fury. She was at the desk. She looked at the paper. She looked at the figures she'd been working with for the past 2 weeks. When was the original easement recorded? She said. 1864, Blackburn said. Under what name? He thought. The original landowner, a man named Carver. He sold to the family I bought from in 71. So there are 2 transfers between the original easement and your deed, she said. Yes. Was the easement explicitly transferred in either deed? He looked at her. He didn't say anything. Because if it wasn't explicitly transferred, she said, and if the easement was specific to Carver and his heirs rather than to the land itself, then Langley's filing is based on a legal theory that a competent lawyer could challenge. Blackburn was quiet for a moment. How do you know that? My father ran a school, but he trained as a land surveyor, she said. Property law in Massachusetts and property law out here aren't identical, but easement law tends to follow similar logic. I could be wrong. You need your lawyer to look at the original recording. She paused. You need your lawyer to look at it now, today, if possible. Langley has been planning this. He didn't file on impulse. He's had someone working on it. She watched Blackburn's face move through several things. The controlled fury she'd seen initially, and then something sharper, which was recognition, and then something she hadn't quite seen in him before, which was the look of a man who was recalculating the value of something he'd already decided was valuable. I'll send a wire to Kansas City this afternoon, he said. Send the original deed description, she said. All 3 of them if you have them. And the Carver recording if Renfrew has it in the civil records. Renfrew keeps everything, Blackburn said. Good. Then go to Renfrew first this afternoon before Langley has any reason to expect you're moving fast. He was already on his feet. He stopped. You know you're telling me what to do. She looked up at him steadily. You said I'd have a seat at the table where decisions are made. So I did. He left for Renfrew's office within the hour. Naomi sat at the desk after he'd gone and looked at the pattern of papers in front of her, the ledgers, the deed copies she'd been cross-referencing, the notes she'd started making about the North Pasture figures. She was tired. She was always tired, in the way that had become so constant it was more like a climate than a condition. But underneath the tiredness, there was something else, something that had been working its way up for the past 2 weeks, and was now close enough to the surface that she could almost name it. She had been here before, the person in the room who understood the numbers better than anyone else, and whose understanding was simultaneously indispensable and unacknowledged. She had been that person in her father's school. She had been that person for the Market Street shop. She had been that person in her marriage in small ways that Thomas, kind as he was, had not always recognized. She was not that person here. Blackburn had listened to her. He had acted on what she'd said. He had gone to Renfrew's office because she had told him to go now, today, before Langley expected it, and he had understood why. That was new. That was different from everything that had come before it, and the difference sat in her chest like a warmth she didn't quite trust yet, but couldn't deny. She picked up the pen and went back to the figures. Outside, through the window she'd been given, the south-facing window, the room that was hers, the afternoon light was changing, going amber and long the way it did in the early weeks of autumn out here, and the land spread away in every direction, enormous and unglamorous and full of difficulty, and the sounds of the ranch moved around the house like weather, a horse's voice, the rhythm of a hammer somewhere, two men's voices going back and forth about something out of earshot. Della was upstairs with May. Rose was probably standing in the crib, practicing. Naomi wrote down a figure and checked it against the column above, and it was right. She moved to the next line. By the time Wesley Blackburn returned from Renfrew's office that evening, with a rolled document under his arm and an expression that meant the news was better than expected, she had worked through 4 more pages of accounts and found 2 more errors, one of which was in Blackburn's favor and one of which was not, and she had noted both with equal precision because that was how she worked. He came to the desk and unrolled the document. The Carver easement, he said, was recorded as personal to Carver and his direct heirs. It wasn't a land easement, it was a personal right of use. She looked at the document. So when Carver sold, the easement didn't transfer, he said. Langley's filing is based on a document that doesn't say what he's claiming it says. She looked at the language carefully. Your lawyer needs to see this tonight if possible. I wired him this afternoon. He's on a train tomorrow morning. Blackburn looked at her. You knew it was likely. I thought it was possible, she said. Langley struck me as a man who works in suggestion rather than substance, the kind of claim that sounds solid until someone reads the actual document. He was quiet for a moment. How much of this did you work out before you sent me to Renfrew? Some of it, she said honestly. I wasn't certain. I'm still not, until your lawyer confirms it. He looked at her for a longer moment than usual. Naomi. She looked up at the sound of her given name. He didn't use it often. He tended toward Mrs. Blackburn in company and a sort of deliberate absence of name in private, as if he was still getting used to the fact of her. Thank you, he said. It was plain and direct, the way everything he said was, and it landed accordingly. It's what you brought me here for, she said. Part of it, he said. She looked back at the document. Let's see what your lawyer says before we congratulate ourselves. But the energy in the room had shifted, and they both felt it. The particular quality of air when something that has been working against you has been, for the moment, turned. It might not hold. Langley would find another angle. That was the nature of men like Langley. The Bellard situation had not resolved. The town was still talking. Mrs. Garrett had told her that morning that 2 more ranch wives had declined a social invitation, which was a petty thing and a practical one simultaneously. None of it was resolved. But something had moved, and Naomi sat at the desk with the Carver easement document in front of her and the household sounds around her. May's voice upstairs, a baby's answering babble, the distant rhythm of the ranch going about its business, and let herself feel, carefully and without excess, that the ground was still holding. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow would bring its own weight, and she would deal with that weight when it arrived, as she had dealt with every other weight that had come before it. Not heroically, not perfectly, not without cost, but steadily and with both hands and without stopping. That, in the end, was the only kind of courage she had ever had. It had gotten her further than anyone on that platform had expected. And she was not done yet. Blackburn's lawyer arrived on the Thursday morning train. His name was Edmund Ferris, and he was not what Naomi had expected. She had anticipated someone in the mold of Eastern legal men she'd encountered in Philadelphia. Formal, slightly distant, operating in a register of careful professional warmth that kept clients at arm's length. Ferris was none of those things. He was short, broad, somewhere past 60, with the kind of face that had been arguing with people for so long it had settled into a permanent expression of mild challenge. He shook Naomi's hand like she was a person whose opinion he intended to take seriously, which immediately put him above most of the people she'd met in this territory. He spent the first hour with the documents. He read the Carver easement recording twice, the deed transfers once each, and the Langley filing with the careful attention of a man who is looking for exactly what he expects to find and is not surprised when he finds it. "This is thin," he said, setting the Langley filing down. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. "This is very thin." He's reading the easement as running with the land because it describes a geographic corridor, the Upper Creek crossing, rather than a named individual. But Carver's recording language is personal, his heirs and assigns. That's Carver's blood, not the land's next owner. He tapped the document. "This gets challenged in front of any competent judge. It doesn't survive." "What about an incompetent judge?" Blackburn said. Ferris looked at him. "Who's on the territorial bench right now?" "Abner Holst, mostly. Hendricks comes through quarterly." "Holst is competent," Ferris said. "Cautious, but competent. This doesn't survive Holst either, as long as we're the ones who file first." He looked between the two of them. "You sent me the wire on Monday. Langley filed Friday. How did you know to move so fast?" Blackburn looked at Naomi. Ferris looked at Naomi. "I thought the filing was strategic rather than legal," she said. "If it had solid legal footing, Langley would have moved on it years ago. He's been circling this property for a long time. The timing, right after we married, right after he came here and assessed me, suggested he was reacting to a changed situation rather than executing a long-held plan. Reactive moves are usually underbuilt." Ferris studied her for a moment. "You've dealt with land filings before?" "No, I've dealt with accounts. The logic is similar. You look at the timing and you ask whether it makes sense for someone who genuinely believes their position is strong. And you concluded it didn't." "I concluded it was worth checking quickly. Your analysis confirms it." Ferris made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and an acknowledgement and turned back to Blackburn. "I'll draft the counterfiling this afternoon. We want to get it in front of Holst before Langley has time to bolster his argument." He paused. "You have an issue, Wes. Not just the filing. Langley's been talking to people in the Territorial Land Office. I heard things on the train down." Blackburn was still. "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggest he has a relationship with someone in that office that goes beyond official business," Ferris said. "Nothing I can prove yet. But if he can influence how a filing is processed or delayed, the legal situation gets more complicated regardless of whether his position is sound." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who in the land office?" Naomi said. "A man named Curtis Breed," Ferris said. "Deputy Registrar." She looked at Blackburn. He was looking at the window. "I know Breed," he said. "He's been in that office 8 years. Langley's been after the North Pasture for 8 years. "That's a long time to develop a relationship," Naomi said. "Yes," Blackburn said. It was a flat sound, the word pressed down to its minimum size by something that was not quite anger and not quite resignation, but was tired in the specific way of a man who has been patient for a long time and is seeing the shape of why that patience may have been used against him. Ferris left them with a list of documents he needed and went to establish himself at the hotel before getting to work. Blackburn and Naomi sat at the desk in the ranch house with the papers between them and the remains of the morning's coffee, and the particular quality of silence that arrived when a problem had just gotten larger than it had been 20 minutes ago. "Curtis Breed," Naomi said. "I've spoken to him twice in 8 years, both times on routine matters. He seemed unremarkable." "Unremarkable is useful," Naomi said, "if you're working for someone who prefers not to be noticed." Blackburn looked at her. "You think Langley's been positioning this for years?" "I think Langley is the kind of man who plays a long game," she said. "The North Pasture, the Bellard arrangement, the land office contact, none of those are impulsive. They're built." She paused. which means we need to think about what else might be built that we haven't found yet. He was quiet. I'm not trying to alarm you unnecessarily, she said. You're not alarming me unnecessarily, he said. You're alarming me very necessarily. He stood up. I need to talk to Hatch. She watched him go and then turned back to the papers and began, systematically, to think about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the gap between those two things might contain. The Langley counterfiling went in on Friday, 2 days after Ferris arrived. Ferris presented it to Judge Holst's clerk personally, which accomplished two things. It moved quickly, and it made clear that the Blackburn response was not going to be slow or unrepresented. Langley's lawyer, a man named Aldous Perch, who had an office in the same building as the land registration office, and was, Naomi noted, a reasonable proximity to Curtis Breed's daily working life, appeared at the courthouse within 4 hours of the Blackburn filing, which told her everything she needed to know about how closely Langley was monitoring the situation. This was where things became publicly complicated. The legal proceeding was not the town-gathering kind of dramatic confrontation that Calverton might have expected. It was quieter than that and more damaging in its way, because the news that Blackburn and Langley were in a formal legal dispute over water rights spread through the territory like any other piece of significant news, gradually, persistently, carried by the people who traveled between places and talked while they did. And the story, as stories did in the absence of complete information, developed its own shape, which was not entirely accurate. The version Naomi heard third hand, through May, who heard it from the girl at the Mercantile who heard it from someone's wife, was that Wesley Blackburn had brought in an outside woman who had convinced him to file against his neighbor over a water dispute that had been settled for years, stirring up trouble that the territory didn't need. She sat with that version for a long time, alone in the kitchen one evening when the house was quiet. The inaccuracy of it was almost remarkable in its construction. The dispute had not been settled. It had been dormant, which was different. She had not convinced Blackburn to file. She had identified the timing, which had allowed him to respond quickly rather than react slowly. The trouble existed before she arrived. She had simply helped position them to address it. None of that was how it was being told. And the frustrating thing, the specific, sharp frustration she had to work to keep from becoming bitterness, was that there was no mechanism to correct it. She could not go to the Mercantile and explain the actual sequence of events. She could not post a notice. She could not call a meeting. The only thing available to her was the long, slow, unglamorous process of being consistently present and consistently herself, and letting time do what argument could not. She knew this. She had always known it, theoretically. Living it was a different matter. The first morning in November, Hatch came to the ranch house with an expression she had learned to read as "there is a problem I am not sure is my place to raise." He was a taciturn man, and she had been working at a cautious understanding with him for 6 weeks. He was not unfriendly, exactly, but he operated in a professional register that had not yet admitted her to whatever level he considered genuine confidence. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, "is Wes in?" "He rode out to the north pasture an hour ago. Should be back by noon." She looked at Hatch's face. "What's happened?" A short pause. "2 of the hands gave notice this morning." She was still. "Which 2? "Morgan and Dell." He said it without inflection. "They didn't give a specific reason. Dell said it was personal circumstances. Morgan didn't say much." "When did they decide?" Hatch looked at her carefully. "I think the decision was made for them," he said. She understood. "Langley." "I can't say that directly," Hatch said. "I don't have proof." "No," she said. "But 2 hands giving notice in the same morning without specific reasons, in the middle of a legal dispute with their employer's neighbor." She looked at the door to the yard. "How good are Morgan and Dell?" "Morgan's the better hand. Dell's adequate. We can replace both if we need to, though it's not ideal timing heading into winter." "All right," she said. "I'll tell Wes when he's back." Hatch nodded. He was turning to go when she said, "Mr. Hatch?" He turned. "How many of the other hands do you think are being approached?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd say at least 2 others have been talked to," he said carefully. "Whether they'll go is another matter." "What would help them decide to stay?" Hatch looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Certainty," he said, "that the ranch is going to come through this hole. Men don't mind a fight, but they want to know the ground under them isn't going to shift." "How do we give them that?" "Win the legal matter," Hatch said simply. Then he left. She stood in the kitchen doorway after he'd gone and thought about certainty and what it required. It required winning. Hatch was right about that. It required the legal matter going the right way, and Ferris was working on it, and the documents supported their position. But legal matters took time, and time was what Langley was also working with. She thought about Curtis Breed. She thought about the land office and the relationship that Ferris had described, 8 years in parallel, with Langley's 8 years of focus on the North Pasture. She thought about what a deputy land registrar could do, in practical terms, that would benefit Langley's position even if the legal argument was weak. Delayed processing. Misfiled documents. A counter-argument that arrived too late because the paperwork had been lost for 3 weeks, and then found again. She went to the desk and pulled out the notes she'd been keeping. She found the dates she'd recorded of every Langley-related event she knew about. The fence visit, the mercantile conversation, the Bellard carriage, the land office filing. She added the date of Morgan and Dell's notices. She looked at the pattern. Langley was moving faster than he had been. The marriage had changed something for him, not made him retreat, but accelerated him. He had been patient for 8 years, and something had made him suddenly impatient. She needed to understand what. When Blackburn came back from the North Pasture and she told him about Morgan and Dell, his face did the thing it did, the controlled stillness, the jaw moving slightly. "He's poaching my hands," he said. "He's trying to make the ranch look unstable," Naomi said. "2 hands leaving at once is a signal. Other people see it and draw conclusions." "I know what he's doing." He set his hat on the table. He was dirty from the ride. There was mud from the North Pasture on his boots, and he was visibly tired in the way of a man who had been managing too many things simultaneously for too many weeks. "I know what he's doing, and I can see it happening, and I can't—" He stopped. She waited. "I can't get in front of it fast enough," he said. "I fix one thing, and there's another thing. The legal matter, the hands, the Bellard family spreading their version of events through every parlor in the territory." "You couldn't get in front of it alone," she said. "He's been building this for years." He looked at her. "But you're not alone," she said. "And you weren't, even before I arrived. You have Hatch, who has been loyal to this ranch through things I don't know about yet. You have Mrs. Garrett, who knows more about this territory than most people in it and doesn't share it frivolously. You have Ferris, who understood the legal situation in 1 hour." She paused. "And you have me." "I know that," he said. "I'm not sure you're using it," she said. He looked at her directly then, the way he did when he was deciding something. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been managing this situation the way you'd manage it alone," she said, "keeping the information close, handling pieces of it separately. That's how you've operated for 20 years, and it's served you. But Langley's approach is to come at you from multiple directions at once, and responding to each direction separately means you're always one move behind." He was quiet. "I'd like to sit down with you, Hatch, and Ferris together," she said. "All of it on the table at once. Not pieces of it, all of it." A long pause. "You think there's something we've missed?" "I think that there's something we haven't connected yet," she said. "The hands, the land filing, the Bellard involvement, the land office contact. They're not separate maneuvers, they're one plan, and if we map them together, we might see the shape of it." He looked at his hat on the table. He looked at the mud on his boots. He looked like a man deciding whether to trust something fully rather than partially, which was, she was learning, a real decision for him. Not performed caution, but the genuine calculus of a man who had been burned by trust before and had rebuilt his self-reliance so thoroughly that opening it back up felt like removing armor in the middle of a conflict. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll get Ferris from the hotel. You get Hatch." She nodded. "Naomi," he said. She looked at him. "You're right," he said. "I've been managing it alone." It was not easy for him to say. She could see the effort of it, slight but real. "I know," she said. "Old habits." "Yes." He picked up his hat. "Tomorrow morning." The meeting happened at 7 in the ranch house kitchen with the doors closed and coffee for everyone. Ferris arrived looking like a man who had been working late and had slept adequately anyway, which was probably the product of a legal career that had trained him to function on incomplete rest. Hatch arrived with the punctuality of someone for whom being on time was a form of respect. Naomi had organized the papers the night before. She laid them out on the table. Not like a presentation, just like information made visible, and let everyone look before she said anything. It was Ferris who spoke first. "You've mapped this out," he said. "I've tried to," she said. "The dates," he said, studying the timeline she'd constructed. "The land office filing and the Bellard visit are within 3 days of each other." "Within 3 days of our marriage," she said. "The Bellard visit came first, the day after we returned from Renfrew's office. The land filing came 2 days later." "Someone told Langley you'd married," Hatch said. He said it flatly, like a man who had already worked this out and was confirming it. Quickly. "Who in Calverton would contact Langley fast enough for him to have a filing prepared within 2 days?" Naomi said. The table was quiet. "Perch," Ferris said. "Aldous Perch would know immediately. He watches the Renfrew filings as a matter of professional practice. And Perch has the relationship with Breed in the land office, which is how Langley gets information routed the way he wants it." "So Renfrew's clerk reported the marriage to Perch," Naomi said. "Perch reported to Langley, and Langley filed within 48 hours because the marriage changed his calculation." "Why did it change it?" Blackburn said. She looked at him. "Because he knew you'd been holding out on the Bellard match for 3 years. He'd been counting on the slow pressure of that arrangement to eventually make you either accept it or look unreasonable for refusing it. When you married someone else entirely, that leverage disappeared overnight." Hatch set down his coffee. "So he panicked." "He reacted," Naomi said, "which is what I expected. And a reactive move from a man who'd been building carefully is going to have gaps." "The easement language is one gap," Ferris said. He was looking at the timeline with the expression of a man fitting a puzzle piece. "What are the others?" "That's what I need your help to find," Naomi said. They worked through the morning. It was not a dramatic process. It was the deliberate, tedious work of going through documents and dates and cross-referencing known facts against probable facts. The kind of work that required patience and a willingness to be wrong repeatedly before being right once. What emerged, over the course of 3 hours, was a picture none of them had fully seen before. The relationship between Perch and Langley was likely older than 8 years. Ferris, who had contacts throughout the territorial legal system, recalled a land matter from the early 70s in which Langley had acquired a piece of water-adjacent property under disputed circumstances. The land office at the time had processed the acquisition with unusual speed. The deputy registrar at that time was, he had to think, he had to look at notes he'd kept from other matters. A man whose assistant was a young Curtis Breed just beginning his career. "So Breed and Langley go back 15 years, Naomi said. "At least," Ferris said. "And Breed has been in the Calverton land office for 8 years, which is exactly how long Langley has been focused on the North Pasture," Hatch said. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man reassessing how much he'd underestimated a problem. He didn't get interested in the North Pasture and then happened to develop a contact in the land office. Breed moved to Calverton first, and then Langley shifted his focus here. The room was quiet for a moment as the shape of it settled. "Langley didn't spot an opportunity in this territory," Blackburn said. "It was the first time he'd spoken in 40 minutes. He manufactured one. He placed a contact in the land office and then moved on the nearest valuable property once the contact was established. Which means," Naomi said carefully, "that the North Pasture may not be the real objective, or not the only one." Everyone looked at her. "If you establish a contact in a land office, you're not doing it for one piece of property," she said. "You're doing it for access to an information stream and the ability to influence filing processes over time. The North Pasture is the current visible target, but there may be other properties in this territory that Langley has been building toward. And the North Pasture dispute is either the main prize or a distraction from something larger." Ferris leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "That's a significant claim." "I know," Naomi said. "I might be wrong, but if I'm right, then winning the easement challenge doesn't end this. It just moves it." Blackburn was looking at her. She could feel the quality of his attention. It had a weight she'd grown accustomed to, the specific gravity of a man who listened completely rather than partially. "How do we find out?" he said. "We look at what other properties are adjacent to Langley's existing land," she said. "We look at which of them have had any kind of filing irregularity, delay, or unusual processing in the past 8 years. And we ask Ferris to see if his contacts can tell him anything about what Langley's legal activity has looked like outside this territory." Ferris made a note. I'll write some letters today. Hatch said, I know 3 other ranchers in this territory who've had trouble with filings in the past 5 years. Minor things, each time. Delays, a misfiled plat. They chalked it up to government inefficiency. Which, Naomi said, is exactly what it looks like when it's designed to look like something. The meeting ended at 10. Ferris went back to the hotel to write letters. Hatch went back to the ranch work with the particular focused energy of a man who has been given clarity on something he'd been sensing without being able to name. Blackburn stayed at the table. When they were alone, he said, You didn't sleep last night. She looked up. A few hours. You were working on that timeline. I needed to see the shape of it. He was quiet. Outside, the November morning was gray and cold in the way of early winter out here. Not dramatic, just persistent. The sounds of the ranch continued as they always did, the ongoing low-frequency noise of animals and equipment and men working. I've been running this ranch for 18 years, Blackburn said. 14 of them alone. He looked at the table, at the papers she'd organized. I've had good years and bad years and 2 years that nearly ended it. I've dealt with droughts and hard winters and men who've tried to take from me in ways I could see clearly. He stopped. I've never dealt with something this systematic, not because I couldn't handle it, but because I didn't see the whole of it until now. She didn't say anything. You saw it in 3 weeks, he said. I came to it fresh, she said. You've been inside it for years. It's harder to see a pattern when you're standing in the middle of it. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one, she said. He looked at her directly. This isn't what you agreed to, he said. You came here to manage accounts and build a household and raise your daughters. You didn't sign on for a territory-level land scheme. No, she said. But here it is. She looked at him steadily. And I'd rather deal with it than have it deal with us on its own schedule. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, When this is resolved, when, she said firmly. The corner of his mouth moved. When this is resolved, I'd like to discuss what else you want, beyond accounts and household management. She looked at him. Such as? You mentioned a school, he said. Not recently, but back at Agnes Hartley's. You said your father ran one. You said the school board replaced you with someone more suitable. She had not expected him to remember that. That was a passing comment. I remember passing comments, he said. Do you want to run a school? She was quiet for a moment. The question arrived with an unexpectedness that temporarily overrode her usual composure. Not because it was startling, but because it was considerate in a specific way, not asking what she could do for the ranch, but what she wanted for herself, and meaning it as a genuine question rather than a performative one. There's no school in Calverton, she said carefully. No, there isn't. The children out here are learning at home or not much at all. That's right. She looked at the window. She thought about her father's schoolroom in western Massachusetts, the smell of chalk and wood stove, the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something they hadn't understood before. She thought about teaching the younger children while her father handled the older ones, and the school board in their good coats coming in one afternoon to tell her father that his daughter was a fine helper, but they'd hired a proper schoolmaster now. Thank you. Yes, she said. I want to run a school. All right, he said. We'll figure out the building, after Langley. She looked at him. He had said we'll figure out the building the way a person says something they've already half decided, which meant he'd thought about this before raising it, which meant he had been paying attention in a way she hadn't fully registered. She did not say anything effusive. That wasn't how they were with each other. She said, "Thank you," in the same plain voice he'd used when he'd thanked her about the easement, and he nodded, and they went back to work. The following week was the hardest of the whole of it. 3 things happened in the span of 5 days, and each of them came from a different direction, which was how Naomi knew they were coordinated, even if she couldn't prove it. The first was a piece in a small territorial newspaper, a publication out of the nearest large town, 40 miles east, that covered land and business matters. The piece did not name Naomi directly. It referred to a recent change in the Blackburn Ranch household and suggested that the resulting legal complications were causing concern among neighboring landowners about the stability of one of the territory's larger operations. The language was careful enough to be unprovable, but specific enough to be recognizable. Someone had given the newspaper the story. The newspaper had published it without checking the facts, because it confirmed a narrative people already found interesting. Blackburn read it once, set it down, and said nothing about it. Naomi read it, felt the cold anger move through her, and said nothing about it either because there was nothing useful to say. The second thing was a visit from Margaret Bellard, alone this time, without Clara. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and was shown into the parlor by Mrs. Garrett, who had the expression of a woman performing a courtesy she found entirely unnecessary. Naomi set down the account she'd been working on and went to the parlor. Margaret Bellard was sitting with her hands folded and her back straight, and the particular composure of a woman who has decided she is going to be pleasant if it kills her. "Mrs. Blackburn," she said. "Mrs. Bellard," Naomi said. She did not offer tea. She sat down in the chair across and waited. "I've come to apologize," Margaret said. The words came out carefully, as if she were navigating around obstacles. "My previous visit was not gracious. I was operating from assumptions I should not have held." Naomi looked at her steadily. "What changed?" Margaret's composure flickered slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "You didn't come to apologize because you've reconsidered your assumptions," Naomi said. "You came because something changed. I'd like to know what." A silence. Then something in Margaret Bellard's face shifted. The careful social surface slipped for just a moment, and underneath it was something unexpected. Worry. "It's Clara," she said. Naomi waited. "Langley has made certain suggestions to my husband," Margaret said slowly, "about the benefits of an arrangement between our family and his. Financial arrangements. In exchange for certain things." She stopped. "My husband is interested. Clara is not." Naomi looked at her. "Langley wants to use your daughter to secure something." "He wants access to my husband's connections in the territorial business community," Margaret said. "He's been using the situation here as a way to make us look like we need an alliance. The newspaper piece, the suggestion that a neighboring ranch's instability reflects poorly on surrounding properties." Her voice was controlled, but it cost her. "We've been played against you, Mrs. Blackburn, and my daughter may be the price of it." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "How old is Clara?" she said. 26. "What does Clara want?" Margaret looked at her hands. "Clara wants to teach school," she said. "She's been teaching the Hendricks children for 2 years. She's good at it." The word good came out with a faint, complicated pride that didn't know quite how to be straightforward. "I told her it was a temporary arrangement, that she'd marry and—" She stopped. Naomi let the silence sit for a moment. "I'm going to need your husband's cooperation with something," Naomi said. "Not against Langley directly. A pattern of information about land filings in this territory over the past 8 years. If your husband has dealt with the land office at all in that time, he may have information he doesn't realize he has." Margaret Bellard looked at her with an expression that had reorganized itself entirely. The woman who had walked into the parlor with an apology constructed from strategy was gone. What was looking back at Naomi now was a mother who was frightened for her daughter and had just realized she might have walked into the conversation she actually needed. "I can arrange that," she said. "And Mrs. Bellard," Naomi said, "talk to Clara." A pause. "About what?" "About what she wants," Naomi said. "Not what's suitable. What she wants." Margaret Bellard left 40 minutes later, and Naomi stood at the parlor window watching the carriage go and thought about unlikely alliances and how they tended to form at the edges of problems rather than the centers, where everyone was positioned too firmly to move. The third thing that happened that week was the one she hadn't anticipated. It came on a Thursday evening. Blackburn at the north fence late, Hatch with the hands, Mrs. Garrett in the kitchen. Naomi was in the back room with both girls, the comfortable end-of-day hour when Rose and Della were fed and clean and moving through the brief sociable window between wakefulness and sleep, making the small sounds they made at that hour, rolling toward each other and back, batting at whatever was within reach. Naomi was sitting on the floor between them. This was where she always was at this hour, back against the crib, legs extended, half watching and half thinking. When she heard the front door and then Blackburn's boots on the floorboards, and then a different step, one she didn't recognize. She came out into the hall. Blackburn was in the entrance with a man she hadn't seen before. The man was thin, younger than she'd expected, and he had the look of someone who had traveled hard and recently. He He was holding his hat in both hands the way people held hats when they were uncertain of their reception. Naomi, Blackburn said. His voice was neutral in the way it was when he was deciding how much weight to put into words. This is Robert Fairley. He works in the Territorial Land Office. She looked at Fairley. He's not Curtis Breed, Blackburn said. He's the man who's been watching what Curtis Breed does. Fairley looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely certain was survivable and was now committed to it. I've been keeping records, he said, for 2 years, of irregularities. I didn't know who to bring them to. He glanced at Blackburn. I heard there was a woman at the Blackburn Ranch who understood accounts and patterns. His voice was careful. I thought that might mean someone who would understand what I've recorded. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Blackburn, who was watching her with an expression she had come to know well by now. The particular quality of a man who has just understood something about the person he'd brought home from a platform, again, and is adding it to the accumulation of things he understands. Come in, Mr. Fairley, she said. I'll make coffee. She turned toward the kitchen without waiting to see if they followed, because she already knew they would, and because there was work to do, and it was not going to wait for anyone to stand in a hallway working up to it. Behind her, she heard the front door close, and the sound of 2 sets of boots following her toward the light. Robert Fairley's records were kept in a ledger he carried inside his coat, close to his body, the way a person carries something they're afraid to lose. He set it on the kitchen table and opened it with the careful movements of a man who had been living with a secret long enough that revealing it felt physically dangerous. The records went back 22 months. Dates, filing numbers, notes in a small cramped hand about what had been submitted and what had been processed, and the gap between the two, the delays, the misfiled documents, the 3 instances where a plat had been recorded under a slightly wrong parcel number that took weeks to correct, and in 2 of those cases the correction period happened to coincide with a filing from an adjacent property that benefited from the confusion. Adjacent properties, Langley owned or Langley connected in each case. Naomi read through it slowly while Fairley drank his coffee and Blackburn sat across from her, and neither of them spoke. The kitchen clock marked the minutes. Outside, the November dark was complete and cold. She turned the last page and looked up. Why 2 years, she said. Why did you start keeping records 2 years ago specifically? Fairley looked at his hands. Because 2 years ago, a woman came into the land office to correct a filing on her late husband's property. The delay had cost her the window to register a water claim. By the time the paperwork was processed correctly, someone else had filed on the same water access. He paused. The someone else was a holding company. I looked into the holding company. It traced back through 2 intermediary names to Arthur Langley. The kitchen was quiet. She lost the claim, Naomi said. She lost the property eventually, Fairley said. She couldn't sustain the ranch without the water access. She sold at a loss 8 months later. Naomi looked at the ledger. And the buyer? Another intermediary, Fairley said, which I believe traces back to Langley, but I couldn't prove it before she sold. Naomi looked at Blackburn. He was looking at the ledger with the focused stillness of a man who had just understood the full geometry of something that had been pressing on him from an angle he couldn't quite locate. The north pasture isn't the main target, she said, confirming aloud what she'd told him a week ago. It's one of several. He's been systematically acquiring water-adjacent land throughout this territory by creating filing problems that make properties impossible to sustain. Over how long? Blackburn said to Fairley. 8 years in this office, Fairley said. Before that, somewhere else. I don't have those records. Ferris might, Naomi said. She was right. The letters Ferris had written came back over the following week, and they came back with answers that filled in the picture Fairley's ledger had started. In 2 other territories, one to the north, one to the east, there were patterns of land acquisition that bore the same fingerprints. A land office contact, filing delays on vulnerable properties, subsequent acquisition through intermediaries, and at the end of the chain, Arthur Langley with more water access and more leverage than he'd had before. It was not a small operation. It was not a man pursuing one piece of contested land out of stubbornness. It was a systematic strategy, executed over years, that had displaced at least a dozen property owners that they could document, and probably more that they couldn't. Ferris presented the compiled evidence to Judge Holst in the second week of November. He did not present it as a land dispute between Blackburn and Langley. He presented it as a pattern of land office corruption and fraudulent acquisition affecting multiple property owners across the territory, with documentation from a land office employee who had witnessed the irregularities directly and kept records at personal risk. Holst read for 2 days. He was, as Blackburn had said, a cautious man, and cautious men read carefully. On the 3rd day, he issued a temporary injunction suspending all pending land filings in which Curtis Breed had been the processing registrar, and he referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation. Curtis Breed resigned from the land office that same afternoon. Aldous Perch, Langley's lawyer, issued a statement saying his client denied all allegations and was confident the matter would be resolved in his favor. The statement had the quality of words that know they are losing. It took another 6 weeks for the full investigation to move forward. Government processes were slow everywhere and slower in territories. But the injunction held, and the Blackburn easement challenge was resolved in their favor by Holst before Christmas, on the grounds that the Langley filing had been based on a misrepresentation of the source document. The North pasture stayed whole. The water rights on the Upper Creek remained uncontested. Arthur Langley did not ride to the Blackburn Ranch to concede anything. He did not appear in Calverton for several weeks. When he did reappear, he was quieter, and the particular confidence that had preceded him everywhere was diminished in a way that everyone noticed and very few mentioned directly. The investigation was ongoing. His intermediary companies were being examined. The woman who had lost her property 2 years ago had come forward to Ferris with her own documentation, and she was not the only one. Langley was not finished, legally or financially. These things took time, but he was no longer advancing. The morning after Holst's decision on the easement, Naomi woke before the light and lay in the dark and let herself feel the resolution of it. Not triumphantly, not with any dramatic sense of vindication, just with the plain relief of something heavy being set down after a long carry. It was over, at least this portion of it. The ground was solid. She lay there for a while listening to the girls breathe and thought about what it meant. She had arrived on a platform in October with 2 infants and $22 and the specific determination of a woman who had run out of other options. She had expected, at best, a workable arrangement in a place she didn't know with a man she didn't know. Enough stability to raise her daughters without constant fear. She had not expected this. The ledgers and the easement language and the midnight coffee and the man who asked her at 4 a.m. if she needed anything and accepted whatever she said. She had not expected to matter in the way she had mattered here. Not to be needed, which was familiar. To matter. To be a person whose presence changed the shape of things in ways that were visible and counted. That was different. That was new, and she hadn't fully absorbed it yet, and she suspected the absorbing of it would take a long time, which was fine. She was good at patient processes. She got up. She fed the girls. She went downstairs. Blackburn was at the table with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and she looked at him, and there was a moment of the particular communication they had developed over 3 months of sharing a house and a problem. The kind of communication that doesn't require words because it has been built out of enough of them that some things can be said without them now. "It's done," she said. "For now," he said. "For now," she agreed. "That's enough." He poured her coffee and set it in the right spot, and she sat down. And that was the extent of the celebration, which was exactly what it needed to be. In the weeks that followed, the territory began its slow readjustment. The ranchers who had experienced filing irregularities came forward one by one, some reluctantly, some with visible relief at finally having a name for what had happened to them. Robert Fairley testified to the Attorney General's investigators with a thoroughness that suggested 2 years of careful record-keeping had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ferris coordinated the legal pieces with an efficiency that made Naomi suspect he had been looking for a case of this scope for a long time, and had found it more satisfying than he would admit. Margaret Bellard's husband provided the business community documentation that Naomi had asked for, a list of land transactions he'd been adjacent to over 8 years that, when laid against Fairley's ledger, filled in 3 gaps in the pattern. He provided it quietly, without fanfare, in the way of a man doing something he should have done earlier and knew it. His wife did not accompany him when he brought the papers to Ferris. She was, Naomi heard through Mrs. Garrett, having a different conversation with her daughter. Clara Bellard came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in December, alone, riding a horse that suggested she was more competent than her mother's drawing room had implied. She asked to speak with Naomi, and they sat in the kitchen, the two of them, with coffee between them and the sounds of the ranch outside, and Rose and Della audible somewhere above them where May was managing the morning. "My mother told me what you said," Clara said, "about what I want." "What do you want?" Naomi said. "I want to teach," Clara said. It came out with the directness of something that had been said out loud before, but never to the right person. "I'm good at it. The Hendricks children. The youngest one couldn't read at all in January, and she's reading simple sentences now. I know what I'm doing." "I know," Naomi said. "Mrs. Garrett has connections throughout this county. She's mentioned your work with the Hendricks family twice, which means she's thought about it more than twice." Clara looked at her. "She has?" "Mrs. Garrett doesn't say things twice that she's only thought about once," Naomi said. "It's not her way." Something in Clara's expression loosened, the careful composure of a young woman who had spent a long time managing her mother's expectations. "I heard you want to open a school," she said. "I do," Naomi said. "I'd like to be part of that," Clara said. "If you'd have someone. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." Naomi looked at her. She thought about what her father's school had needed and what it had been. She thought about the school board in Massachusetts and their more suitable replacement, and the particular, specific waste of a person whose capabilities are misread because they don't fit the expected form. "I'd have someone," she said. Clara Bellard nodded, and the relief in her face was real and unguarded, and made her look younger and more genuine than anything Naomi had seen from her before. The building conversation with Blackburn happened that evening, seriously and specifically, rather than as a future tense intention. He had been thinking about it. She could tell from the way he had the information already organized, which was how he approached things he'd decided were going to happen. There was a structure at the edge of the south pasture, a storage building that was solid but had been used for equipment that had since been consolidated elsewhere. Hatch thought it could be repurposed without major construction. The windows needed work. The floor was dirt, but could be planked. "Spring," Blackburn said. "We can have it ready by spring." "I'll need books," Naomi said. "More than we have here." "Write a list. Ferris goes back to Kansas City next month. He can arrange a shipment." She wrote the list that night. It was long. She did not apologize for its length. The winter was hard in the way frontier winters were, not catastrophically, but persistently. Cold that arrived in November and did not relent until March. Snow that came and went and came back. The particular isolation of a large property when the roads were difficult and the distances between places asserted themselves. The ranch managed it as it always had, with the accumulated practical knowledge of years and the particular competence of Hatch and the hands who knew this land and its patterns. Naomi learned winter on the frontier that year. She learned it the way she had learned everything, by paying attention and asking questions and not pretending to know things she didn't. She made mistakes. She gave May the wrong instructions about the root cellar arrangement, and it caused a problem that took 2 days to sort out. She misjudged the time a task would take and left something else undone that mattered more. She argued with Blackburn about a financial decision involving the spring cattle purchase, and was partly right and partly wrong, and they worked through it with the specific friction of two people who are both accustomed to being right and are learning how to be right together. It was not smooth. It was never smooth. That was the truth of it. The domestic reality underneath the story that could be told about them was full of the ordinary difficulty of two strong-willed people learning to share a life, negotiating everything from sleep schedules to account management to the question of what to do when they disagreed and neither was willing to concede simply for the sake of peace. Blackburn was not an easy man. She had known that from the beginning. He was not easy in ways that sometimes made her jaw tighten and her temper rise, and she was not easy in ways that she could see, in his face, occasionally cost him. They worked at it. That was the honest word for what they did. They worked at it, without pretending it was effortless, and the working was its own kind of proof that it mattered. Rose walked for the first time on a January morning 7 steps across the kitchen floor before sitting down with an expression of immense satisfaction. Blackburn was at the table when it happened. He watched all 7 steps without saying anything and then said, very quietly, 7, as if counting was the most complete response available to him, and Naomi looked at him and saw on his face something entirely unguarded, The expression of a man who had not known he wanted to see a child take her first steps until he was watching it happen. Della walked 3 weeks later, in May's arms, refusing to do it for anyone else first, which was consistent with her character. Blackburn told people they were his daughters. He did it in the plain, matter-of-fact way he did everything, not making a point of it, but not allowing any ambiguity. When Hatch introduced him to a new seasonal hand in February, and the hand asked about the children he'd seen in the yard, Blackburn said, "My daughters," and moved on to the next topic. When Ferris, back from Kansas City with a crate of school books and the completed paperwork on 2 more properties connected to the Langley investigation, asked how the girls were doing, Blackburn described Della's walking milestone with the specific detail of a man who had been paying more attention than he realized. Clifford Hayes left the territory in February. The reasons were not entirely clear. Some combination of a failed business arrangement and a property dispute that had nothing to do with the Blackburns, and everything to do with his own poor decisions, which was the way things tended to resolve themselves for men like Hayes. Naomi heard about his departure from Ruth Alcott at the Mercantile and felt nothing particular about it, which was itself a kind of answer. She had spent some energy on her anger at Hayes, and the anger was gone now, not forgiven exactly, but finished, composted into something that had been more useful than the original feeling. The school opened in April. It was not grand. It was a repurposed storage building with new planked floors and repaired windows and 12 desks that Cobb had built over the winter with the focused competence he brought to every task he was given. It had a wood stove at the back and a chalkboard at the front, and 6 shelves of books along the south wall and morning light through the east window that fell across the first row of desks in a way that was, if not beautiful, at least good. Naomi stood in it the morning before the first students arrived and let herself have one quiet minute alone with what it was. She thought about the school board in Massachusetts and their more suitable man. She thought about $22 and a platform and 8 rejections. She thought about the school her father had run and his surveyor's training and the easement language that had turned the tide of a legal battle he'd never known would matter. People carried things forward through time in ways they never anticipated. Her father's knowledge in her hands, here, in a territory he'd never visited, solving a problem he'd never imagined. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him with the clarity that had replaced grief over 14 months of surviving without him. Not without sorrow, but with a kind of settled understanding. Thomas had been a good man who had loved her and had not been able to protect her from the difficulty of the world. The difficulty of the world had turned out to be navigable anyway. She had navigated it. She was still navigating it. She would teach these children, and Clara Bellard would teach these children, and they would build something here that was real and would outlast the controversy and the legal proceedings and the whispers in the Mercantile. That was how things actually lasted, not through dramatic confrontation, but through consistent, patient construction day after day, in buildings with dirt floor origins and morning light. Clara arrived at 7:30 with a composed energy that Naomi recognized as barely contained excitement, professional and genuine at the same time. She had organized her own set of materials, made her own notes about the 14 enrolled students and their ages and what she knew about their prior learning. She was prepared in the way of a person who has been ready for a long time and is finally in the right place. "Nervous?" Naomi said. "No," Clara said. Then, "Yes, a little." "Good," Naomi said. "The first day should feel like something." It did. 14 children arrived between 8 and 8:30, ranging in age from 5 to 12. They were frontier children, practical and watchful and more capable than their ages might suggest, accustomed to responsibility in ways that city children weren't, and less accustomed to sitting still for extended periods, which became apparent in the first 20 minutes, and did not fully resolve itself that day or for several days after. Naomi had expected that. She had been a frontier child herself in the ways that mattered, and she taught accordingly, correctly, with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of genuine interest in what they knew already, which was often considerable and rarely credited. By noon, she had their attention. By the end of the day, she had 2 of the older ones asking questions that went past what the morning's lesson had covered, which was the best possible sign. She walked back to the ranch house in the late afternoon with both girls. They had been in the schoolroom for the first hour, observing from a safe distance before May had taken them home, and the walk was short and the air was cold and clear with the specific clarity of an April afternoon when winter is genuinely leaving rather than just resting. Blackburn was at the fence near the south barn. He looked up when she came across the yard. "How was it?" he said. She thought about the 14 children and the morning light, and Clara's barely contained readiness, and the boy who had asked, at 10 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, why rivers ran east when the land seemed flat. "Good," she said. It was good. He looked at her face for a moment. He was reading something in it. She knew this about him now, how he looked at her when he was filing information, adding to the picture he'd been building since a platform in October. "You were doing this your whole life," he said, "before everything else happened." "Yes," she said. "It shows," he said. She looked at him. He said it the way he said things that he meant completely but didn't embroider, plainly, directly, with no performance attached. She had learned that his plainness was its own form of care. It meant he wasn't managing her. It meant what he said was what he thought, and what he thought was that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been rejected 8 times on a platform in October. She had been called a charity case and a schemer and a disruption to arrangements that existed before her arrival. She had been discussed in saloons and parlors and a territorial newspaper, always as a complication rather than a person. None of those descriptions had been accurate. They had been the assessments of people working from incomplete information, seeing 2 babies in a travel bag, and drawing conclusions about what that combination meant. What it had meant was this: a woman who did not stop. A woman who had learned her father's skills in her own and carried them forward through grief and poverty and 7 rejections, and an 8th that had been the loudest and had turned out to matter the least. A woman who could read a column of accounts and an easement document and a man's face and a child's confusion about rivers with the same attentiveness, because attention was what she had always had in greatest abundance, and it had never run out. She went inside and started supper and called May about the girls and checked on the accounts that were waiting on the desk and thought about what the boy's question about rivers implied about his understanding of topography, which was the beginning of a lesson she could build. The Langley investigation concluded the following autumn. Curtis Breed entered into a legal agreement with the Territorial Attorney General that involved his testimony against Langley in exchange for reduced personal penalties. Aldous Perch's license to practice law in the territory was suspended pending a separate review. Langley himself faced civil claims from 11 property owners whose filings had been affected. The woman who had lost her ranch 2 years ago was the first-named plaintiff, and she received the largest settlement, which did not give her back the years or the property, but gave her something real to stand on going forward. Arthur Langley was not imprisoned. The law in that territory at that time had limited reach for the category of harm he had done: manipulation of processes rather than direct violence, financial damage rather than physical. He paid. He paid considerably. He sold 3 properties to meet the civil judgments and was diminished, not destroyed, which was the unsatisfying truth of how most men like him concluded. Naomi thought about that for a while when the final settlement figures were published, and Ferris sent a letter summarizing the outcome. She sat with the imperfection of it, with the fact that 11 families had been harmed, and the resolution was financial and partial and would never fully restore what had been taken. She thought about justice, which she had wanted completely and gotten incompletely, which was most of what justice ever was. The boy who had asked about rivers had moved on to asking about mountains. 2 of the older students were reading at levels that surprised her and would surprise their parents more. Clara was teaching the younger children with a naturalness that confirmed everything Naomi had suspected about what was wasted when capable people were put in unsuitable arrangements. The schoolroom was real. It was daily and persistent and unglamorous, and children learned things in it that they would carry forward into lives she would never fully know, which was how teaching worked. You gave things away, and they moved through time without you, arriving in places and moments you could not predict and would never witness. That was enough. More than enough. Rose and Della turned 2 in the early spring of their 2nd year on the Blackburn Ranch. Blackburn made pancakes for the occasion because it was a thing he had apparently done with some competence and had not mentioned before. And the girls ate them with the focused enthusiasm of 2-year-olds encountering something excellent. And May sang something in her language that the girls tried to imitate, and Mrs. Garrett gave each of them a hair ribbon with the slightly stiff manner of a woman unaccustomed to giving gifts but committed to it. And Hatch came in from the yard and set 2 small carved wooden horses on the table. He had made them over the winter, he said, not making much of it, and looked at the girls with an expression that was not comfortable and was entirely genuine. Naomi watched all of it from her chair at the table. She watched Blackburn cut a second pancake for Della, who was pointing at it with the commanding certainty of a person who knew what she wanted. She watched Rose examine the carved horse with the serious attention she brought to everything, turning it over, tapping it with one finger, satisfied. The babies once dismissed as burdens. The girls who had been called a prop, a trap, a complication. Sitting at a table in a house that was theirs, completely, legally, finally theirs, being loved imperfectly and persistently by people who had chosen them, which was the only kind of love that came with any actual weight behind it. Not because it was easy, because people had looked at the difficulty and stayed anyway. Naomi thought about the 7 rejections sometimes, not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the clear-eyed perspective of someone who has lived far enough past a thing to see its shape. Every one of those men had refused her based on what she appeared to be. A burden, an obligation, a risk. None of them had stayed long enough to find out what she actually was, which was the thing that had made the difference. The accounting, the easement, the school, the map of Langley's scheme laid out on a kitchen table that had helped unravel 8 years of deliberate harm. The 8th man had not walked away. He had asked one question and listened to the answer and made a decision and stood behind it when it cost him. That was the whole of what had been different, and it had made the whole of the difference. Outside, the spring morning was coming in through the south-facing window. The window she had been given on the first morning, the room that had been made hers, in the house that was hers now in every sense of the word. The land spread away in every direction, enormous and unglamorous and full of difficulty and worth every bit of it. Della picked up the carved horse and handed it to Rose. Rose took it and held it in both hands and looked at her sister with the specific, uncomplicated generosity of a child who has never been told that what she has is not enough to share. Naomi watched her daughters and thought that this was the thing she would carry forward, not the legal victory, not the school, not the accounting work, or the easement language, or the map of Langley's scheme, though all of those mattered. What she would carry was this, that the people who had dismissed her had been wrong not just about her, but about what made something worth having. They had looked at difficulty and seen liability. She had looked at difficulty and kept moving, and what she had found on the other side of it was not ease, but something more durable than ease. A life that held because it had been built to hold, by people who chose it, repeatedly, without certainty of outcome, and stayed. That was the only way anything real ever got built. The girls finished their pancakes. The morning continued. The school waited at the edge of the south pasture with its planked floors and its morning light and its 14 children who would become 20 and then 30 as word spread that there was a real school now, with real teachers who took real interest. Naomi Ashcroft Blackburn, who had been refused 8 times on a platform with 2 infants in her arms, picked up her coffee and looked out the south-facing window at the land that was hers and the life she had built in it, imperfectly, honestly, without stopping, and felt something she had learned not to name too quickly, because the things you name too quickly tended to move when you looked directly at them. She let it sit unnamed, warm and solid, the way the best things did. Outside, the spring morning continued doing what spring mornings did, arriving, regardless of what the winter had been, because that was the nature of mornings and of springs and of people who understood that continuing was not defeat, but the whole point, the only point, the thing that made anything else possible at all.